The night was longer than anyone remembered. Not just longer in hours, but heavier, thicker, as if darkness itself had gained weight. The sun had been sinking lower each day, dragging its weak light across the horizon before vanishing too early, leaving behind a cold that crept into bones, into breath, into thought. For people who lived without calendars or clocks, without the promise of tomorrow written anywhere, this wasn't just winter. It felt like a slow, terrifying unraveling of the world. Imagine standing on frozen ground, your feet numb, your hands wrapped in rough hides, staring at the sky where the sun used to climb. Each day it rises a little less, warms a little less, stays a little shorter. No one knows why. No one knows if it will ever return to its former strength. The sky offers no explanation. The earth gives no reassurance. And in that silence, a question begins to take shape in the human mind, perhaps for the first time with true urgency: what if this is the end? For early humans, the sun was not an abstract object. It was life itself. It dried wet ground, ripened plants, guided animals across the land. It marked the difference between survival and death. When it weakened, everything weakened with it. Food became scarce. Animals migrated or vanished. Children cried more often from hunger. Elders grew quieter, their stories shorter, their eyes fixed on the horizon. Every sunset carried a quiet dread, because night was not just dark, it was dangerous. Fire helped, but fire was fragile. It needed fuel, attention, protection from the wind. The sun, by contrast, had always been dependable. It returned every morning without being asked. Until now. Until this season when it seemed uncertain, as if it were hesitating, as if it might simply decide not to come back at all. This was not fear in the modern sense, not the sharp spike of panic followed by relief. It was a slow, grinding unease that settled into the chest and stayed there. A fear without language, without clear shape, but deeply felt. When the nights grew longer than the days, something shifted inside the human mind. Darkness stopped being just the absence of light. It became a presence. A force. Something to be endured. On the longest night, the cold reached a stillness that felt unnatural. The air barely moved. Sound seemed swallowed before they could travel. Breath rose in pale clouds and vanished quickly, like thoughts that never quite formed. Around small fires, people gathered closer than usual, not speaking much. Words felt inadequate. Stories felt risky, as if saying the wrong thing might anger whatever power was pulling the sun away. Children watched the adults carefully. They sensed the tension even if they couldn't understand it. This was how fear passed from one generation to the next, not through instruction, but through silence. Through the way shoulders hunched. Through the way eyes kept drifting upward, searching the sky even at night, as if expecting an answer. Somewhere in that darkness, a realization hovered just beyond conscious thought. If the sun could weaken, then the world was not guaranteed. If the world was not guaranteed, then survival required more than strength or skill. It required meaning. It required belief that endurance mattered, that holding on through the worst night was not pointless. But on that night, no one knew that yet. All they knew was that the darkness had won. The sun had retreated as far as it ever had. This was the edge. The limit. Beyond this point lay only imagination and fear. The sky above was sharp with stars, clearer than at any other time of year. With no moon to soften it, the stars felt closer, almost pressing down. Some people stared at them, tracing invisible paths, wondering if the sun had gone to join them, or if it had fallen somewhere beyond the horizon, wounded or dying. Others avoided looking up at all, focusing instead on the fire, on the small circle of light they could control. Firelight flickered across faces carved by wind and cold. These were not heroic figures. They were tired, uncertain, vulnerable. They had survived storms, predators, hunger. But this was different. You can fight an animal. You can flee a storm. But how do you confront a sky that no longer behaves as it should? In that moment, humanity stood at a psychological threshold. Not because anything dramatic happened, but because nothing did. The sun did not suddenly disappear. The world did not end. Instead, it paused. The darkness reached its deepest point and held there, as if the universe itself were holding its breath. This pause mattered more than anyone realized at the time. Because within it, a fragile possibility existed. If the sun had stopped retreating, perhaps it would return. Not tonight. Not tomorrow. But eventually. And if it did, then this night, this suffering, would have meaning after all. That thought, faint and uncertain, may have been the first true spark of hope humans ever consciously felt. Not hope based on evidence, but hope born from endurance. The idea that simply surviving the darkness could be enough. No one celebrated that night. There were no songs of victory, no sense of triumph. If anything, it was a night of quiet watchfulness. A vigil. Fires were fed carefully. Eyes stayed open longer. Sleep came in shallow waves. The longest night demanded attention, as if turning away from it might invite disaster. And yet, beneath the fear, something else stirred. A subtle shift in perception. Darkness, once purely threatening, became something to move through rather than flee. If it could reach a limit, then it could also reverse. That idea would change everything, though its impact would not be felt for generations. At dawn, the sun rose as it always had, low and pale, barely warming the land. Nothing looked different. The cold remained. Hunger remained. But the sky had not worsened. The light had not diminished further. The world had held. That was enough. No one marked it with symbols. No one carved dates or built monuments yet. But something had been learned at a deep, instinctive level. Darkness was not endless. It had a boundary. And if you endured long enough, something on the other side might be waiting. This understanding did not arrive as knowledge. It arrived as relief. As the easing of a tightness in the chest. As a collective exhale no one knew they had been holding. The sun had not yet returned, but it had stopped leaving. And in a world where survival depended on patterns, that pause was everything. Over time, this moment would become sacred. It would be remembered, ritualized, named. But on that first longest night, it was simply endured. Humans did what they had always done best, they stayed together, they watched, and they waited. And in doing so, they planted the earliest seed of a spiritual idea that would echo across tens of thousands of years. That renewal does not begin with light. It begins in darkness, at the moment when you realize you have reached the bottom, and are still alive. The night stretched on relentlessly, each one seeming longer than the last, pressing in on minds already frayed by cold and hunger. Darkness was no longer merely an absence of light, it had become a tangible presence, one that wrapped around the small human settlements and seeped into bones and thoughts alike. In this environment, the human mind began to change, adapting in ways that would ripple through generations. Fear was no longer an occasional visitor, it was a constant companion, an invisible predator that prowled in the shadows, whispering possibilities of an unending night. Yet, it was precisely this fear that shaped the earliest stirrings of human consciousness, creativity, and spirituality. For prehistoric humans, survival demanded an intimate understanding of the environment, but winter had a way of appending even the most learned strategies. Animals moved differently, food became scarce, rivers froze, and the landscape seemed transformed into a place of unpredictability. The mind, always scanning for threats, became hyper-attuned. Every rustle of wind in the trees, every crackle of ice underfoot, every distant howl or bird call carried significance. Early humans learned to read these subtle cues, to interpret the natural world as a language of survival. Yet alongside this practical attentiveness, a more profound awareness began to emerge, a consciousness of their own fragility in the face of the vast, indifferent cosmos. In the prolonged darkness, imagination and anxiety intertwined. When the sun retreated and the nights grew interminable, minds turned inward as much as outward. People began to assign patterns and agency to the unseen forces around them, creating the earliest forms of myth and spiritual reasoning. The flickering firelight revealed not only faces but shadows that seemed to move independently, suggesting hidden presences in the surrounding trees or rocks. It was impossible to ignore the sense that the world was inhabited by beings beyond human comprehension, powers that controlled the sun, the wind, the hunt, and perhaps even life and death itself. In these moments, the seeds of spiritual thought were planted, not in doctrine or ritual, but in the raw, emotional need to understand and survive. Psychologists today would recognize in these early humans the interplay of fear and pattern recognition that drives so much of human cognition. When danger is omnipresent and survival uncertain, the brain develops an almost obsessive vigilance. Prehistoric humans may have begun seeing intentionality where none existed, not because they were irrational, but because assuming agency increased the likelihood of survival. If a shadow in the trees is a predator rather than a harmless shape, caution preserves life. Over time, these interpretations of the natural world gave rise to the first narratives, stories that framed suffering, danger, and hope in ways that could be shared and remembered. These were not myths in the polished sense, but living experiments in meaning-making, forged under the pressure of real existential stakes. The cold amplified these processes. Physical discomfort and pain sharpened attention, made sensory perception more acute, and intensified emotional responses. Hunger gnawed not just at the belly but at the mind, heightening anxiety and urgency. When the fire sputtered, or the wind howled through cracks in shelters, these sensations merged into an acute awareness of mortality. The long nights forced humans to confront not only external threats but the internal landscape of fear, despair, and resilience. Every whispered worry, every tense glance across the fire, every shiver of bone-deep cold became part of a collective consciousness that valued endurance, adaptability, and imagination in equal measure. In this environment, social bonds became critical. Humans began to understand that survival depended not just on individual skill but on cooperation, communication, and shared vigilance. Sitting together by firelight, they exchanged observations, warnings, and fragments of stories. Even the act of speaking became a ritual of reassurance. Each word, each gesture, each shared glance was a small assertion of presence and control in a universe that felt increasingly indifferent. Through these social interactions, early humans began to develop empathy, theory of mind, and symbolic thought, concepts that would become central to culture, spirituality, and eventually, civilization itself. The psychological impact of prolonged darkness also extended to sleep and dream cycles. With limited daylight, human circadian rhythms were disrupted, producing longer periods of deep sleep, vivid dreams, and perhaps even altered states of consciousness. Dreams may have served as a mental rehearsal for survival, a way to explore danger, loss, and hope in a safe, internal space. They also likely contributed to the earliest spiritual ideas, as people began to sense a world beyond the tangible, a realm where patterns and forces existed independently of human perception. The mind, confronted with a relentless night, reached outward to fill the void with meaning, giving rise to stories, rituals, and symbols that attempted to bridge the gap between the known and the unknowable. These emerging spiritual and psychological frameworks were inseparable from the environment that shaped them. The same darkness that threatened life also offered a canvas for the imagination, a stage upon which early humans could project fears, hopes, and aspirations. Rituals were likely born from the attempt to assert agency in the face of cosmic indifference, small fires, dances, chants, or collective vigils that did not change the sun's behavior but provided a sense of control over experience. Over time, these practices encoded survival knowledge in emotionally resonant ways, turning fear into a tool for learning and endurance. The darkest nights, paradoxically, became the crucibles in which the earliest human spirituality was forged. This interplay of fear, observation, imagination, and social cohesion laid the groundwork for future cultural and religious structures. The prolonged winter nights created a mental environment in which abstract thinking was not a luxury but a necessity. Humans learned to project narratives onto the cosmos, to imagine forces beyond immediate perception, and to communicate these ideas to one another. These cognitive abilities were not abstract, they were practical, adaptive responses to environmental stress. Yet they also marked the beginnings of something more profound, an emotional and spiritual sensitivity that recognized the fragility of life, the inevitability of loss, and the possibility of renewal. Even within the immediate struggle for survival, these early humans experienced moments of awe. A sudden alignment of stars, the brief return of a pale morning sun, the sound of distant predators softened by snow, all of these became imbued with meaning. The mind, conditioned by long nights and scarcity, could not separate survival from significance. Each event was noticed, catalogued, and imbued with emotion. The natural world became a living narrative, and humans, for the first time, began to see themselves as participants rather than mere observers. In these long, dark winters, the human mind began to evolve in ways that would resonate through millennia. Fear sharpened perception, imagination turned danger into narrative, and social bonds provided a framework for collective meaning-making. Darkness, once the simple absence of light, became a teacher, a force that demanded attention, introspection, and creativity. By enduring the longest nights, humans not only survived, they began to understand themselves. They glimpsed the profound interplay between threat and insight, suffering and wisdom, mortality and hope. These were the earliest steps toward what we now recognize as consciousness, culture, and spirituality. And in the midst of this unforgiving landscape, with the cold pressing in and the night stretching endlessly, something fragile and essential emerged, the first awareness that humans could endure the darkness and, in doing so, discover something larger than themselves. It was here, in the slow and relentless nights, that the human mind began to see the world not only as a place of danger but also as a canvas for meaning, a stage for imagination, and a mirror for the soul. This awakening, born of fear and necessity, would become the foundation for every myth, ritual, and philosophy that followed, echoing across tens of thousands of years and shaping the very way humanity understands itself in the universe. Long before the first civilizations, before written language and stone temples, humans began to notice the rhythms of the sky. They were not scientists in the modern sense, but careful observers nonetheless, their survival dependent on patterns that govern day, night, seasons, and the movements of animals. Each movement of the sun, each shift of the stars, each cycle of the moon carried meaning. To survive, to plan, to hunt, to gather, humans had no choice but to pay attention. And over countless generations, this attentiveness became a kind of understanding, a quiet, patient knowledge of time and the world beyond immediate experience. In the frozen landscapes of early winters, people would rise long before the sun dared to climb above the horizon. Their eyes, already adapted to dim light, scanned the sky for any hint of change, any signal that the day would arrive as expected. Shadows on the landscape lengthened and shortened in subtle ways. The angles of sunlight striking rocks and trees offered clues that, while not measured with rulers, were recorded by memory and repetition. There were no clocks, no calendars, no instruments. Just keen perception, and a mind trained to recognize patterns because life depended on it. The movement of the moon became one of their first tools for measuring time. It waxed and waned, offering a visual rhythm that could be followed across nights. While the moon did not provide warmth like the sun, it offered guidance. Its phases marked intervals long enough to plan hunts or migrations, short enough to remain relevant. Early humans began to sense that the cosmos itself was not chaotic. There was an order, even if its purpose was mysterious, and this order could be trusted, if only for a moment, to structure their lives. Stars were observed with similar care. They were constant in a way the sun was not, yet even their constellations shifted with the seasons. Some stars vanished with the arrival of sunlight, only to reappear months later. Others traced arcs that mirrored the movement of the horizon and the distant mountains. These nightly changes were noted by those who had the patience and need to notice. In this way, early humans began to construct mental maps of the heavens. Not maps of longitude and latitude, but of relationships, patterns, and signs. They learned to read the sky like a book whose language was intuition and observation. Over time, certain celestial events became markers for survival. The first appearance of a particular star might signal the migration of prey animals. The angle of sunrise might indicate when to harvest certain plants. The shifting positions of the moon could help track tides or predict storms. Every observation mattered. In these practices, humans were both participants in and witnesses to the rhythms of nature. There was no separation between life and the cosmos. To understand one was to begin to understand the other. This observational practice also required imagination. To see patterns, one had to mentally project the past and future from the present. A hunter watching the horizon at sunrise might notice that the light falls differently each day, subtly shifting against the terrain. From this observation, the mind extrapolates: if the sun rises here today, tomorrow it will rise slightly farther along the same path. The year, although nameless, begins to take shape as an interval that can be anticipated. Humans were building an early concept of time, not abstractly, but practically, through lived experience and careful attention. Patterns alone, however, were not enough. Humans also began to imbue them with meaning. The predictable return of the sun, the moon, and the stars was not merely practical, it became something to rely upon emotionally, psychologically. In the coldest, darkest nights, when firelight flickered against frozen faces, the assurance that the sun would return created an unspoken comfort. Observing the sky became a form of quiet hope. It was a recognition that the universe had its own order, and that this order could be trusted, at least in part, to guide human lives. These early observers were also proto-astronomers in the truest sense. Without instruments, without formal science, they developed a form of empirical reasoning that relied on repetition and careful attention. They noticed that certain events recurred predictably: solstices, equinoxes, the rising of specific stars at dawn. Over generations, these observations accumulated, passed down orally through stories, songs, and gestures. Memory became a repository of practical wisdom and emergent knowledge. What began as survival strategy gradually became cultural inheritance, a shared framework that linked one generation to the next across decades and centuries. Observation was not limited to the sky. It extended to the land and all its living creatures. Patterns in animal behavior were closely noted, as were the subtle shifts in plant life with the changing seasons. Each observation built on the last, creating a complex web of cause and effect. A bird's migration might signal the appearance of edible berries. The behavior of deer could forecast changes in the weather. These insights were not abstract, they were intimately tied to survival. And yet, over time, the same careful attention that saved lives also sparked curiosity, wonder, and the first glimmers of abstract thought. Humans began to recognize connections beyond immediate utility, to see patterns for their own sake. Fire, too, became a crucial part of this observational life. The flame, constantly watched and adjusted, was both tool and teacher. Watching its flicker, noticing how smoke moved with shifts in wind, humans learned subtle lessons about cause, effect, and patience. Firelight extended the day into night, allowing for reflection, teaching, and shared observation when the sun was gone. Around these fires, knowledge was transmitted, stories were formed, and the practice of careful watching became both communal and spiritual. The act of observing, once purely practical, became a ritual in its own right, a bridge between survival and imagination. By observing the world so closely, humans began to develop a sense of timing that went beyond immediate needs. They could anticipate change, predict recurrence, and act preemptively. The mental scaffolding required for this, memory, pattern recognition, projection, laid the groundwork for more complex cognition. The mind learned to think in sequences, to weigh probability, and to imagine futures that had not yet arrived. Each generation inherited not just practical knowledge of the world, but the cognitive tools to interpret it, to plan, and eventually, to reflect upon it in symbolic and spiritual ways. Perhaps most importantly, these early observers began to cultivate patience and humility. The sun did not move faster because they wished it so. Stars did not appear on demand. Animals did not return on a schedule convenient to humans. They had to learn to wait, to watch, and to trust that their careful attention mattered even when immediate results were not apparent. In doing so, they began to develop the first sense of time as cyclical, of life as rhythm, and of existence as something measured not in moments alone, but in patterns stretching across days, seasons, and years. And in this careful, patient observation, something extraordinary occurred. Humans started to perceive themselves as part of the cosmos rather than apart from it. The sky was no longer a distant backdrop, it was a participant in their lives, a partner in survival, a teacher of rhythm and expectation. The sun's rising and setting, the moon's phases, the dance of the stars, all became intertwined with human experience, shaping not just when they hunted or gathered, but how they thought, remembered, and imagined. These first observers of time did more than watch, they began to understand the possibility of continuity, of return, of cycles that would outlast individual lifespans. Through their observations, humans took the first steps toward culture, religion, and philosophy. The regularity of celestial patterns offered reassurance that the world was not chaotic, that there was order beneath the apparent randomness. The mind, trained to notice, predict, and interpret, began to ask questions that had no immediate answers. Why does the sun return? What governs the stars? What is the purpose of the cycles we witness? These questions, born of observation and reflection, laid the foundation for the human quest for meaning, a quest that would continue through millennia, guiding rituals, myths, and eventually, entire civilizations. By learning to observe carefully, humans transformed survival into understanding. The night sky, the rising sun, the waxing moon, all became teachers in a world that offered no instruction manuals. Through observation, humans began to see patterns, anticipate outcomes, and imagine forces beyond immediate perception. They were no longer merely reacting to the environment, they were beginning to interpret it, to participate in it mentally and emotionally, to construct a relationship with time itself. And in that relationship, the earliest sparks of science, spirituality, and culture quietly took root, preparing humanity to endure, reflect, and eventually thrive across the longest nights and coldest winters. The solstice came long before it had a name, long before any human tongue could capture its significance in a single word. To the people who lived through it, it was not a holiday, a celebration, or even a moment to mark on a calendar. It was a sensation, a turning point sensed deep within the bones and heart. The days had been shrinking steadily, sunlight retreating until it seemed that the world was tilting permanently toward shadow. And then, without fanfare, the sun paused. It lingered at its lowest arc in the sky, hesitated along the horizon as if unsure whether to rise again, and for the first time, humans recognized a rhythm that was larger than themselves, a pattern that suggested the darkness would not last forever. In these moments, the solstice was felt rather than observed. Early humans could not measure angles with protractors, nor could they predict celestial mechanics. But they could notice subtle changes, the light at dawn that lingered a fraction longer, the thin crescent of the moon reflecting a pale glow, the way the frost melted slightly earlier in the morning than it had a day before. These small shifts, almost imperceptible to those unaccustomed to careful attention, were enough to signal a profound truth. The longest night, the deepest darkness, had reached its limit. From this point forward, light would gradually return. It was a promise written not in words, but in observation, experience, and endurance. To endure the solstice was to endure uncertainty itself. For countless generations, humans had faced winter as an existential challenge. Food was scarce, predators were more daring, the cold penetrated deep into shelters, and sleep came fitfully, interrupted by fear and hunger. In this context, the solstice was not merely a celestial phenomenon, it was a psychological threshold. It marked a moment in which the human mind could pause, notice a subtle shift in the natural order, and perhaps, for the first time, feel a flicker of hope. Hope, in its earliest form, was neither abstract nor guaranteed. It was a delicate recognition that endurance had its reward, that the cycle of the sun, the seasons, and life itself was larger than any individual struggle. Fire, as always, played a central role. Around the flickering flames, humans gathered, sharing warmth, food, and vigilance. The firelight danced across faces etched with worry and resilience, casting shadows that seemed alive, as if participating in the recognition of this turning point. Children, too young to understand fully the patterns of the sky, absorbed the atmosphere, internalizing the rhythms that their elders sensed. Silence was common, broken only by low conversation or the careful tending of the flames. There was no need for celebration, survival itself was enough of a marvel. The longest night had been endured, and the world had not ended. That fact, though simple, carried a weighty significance. The solstice also shaped the way humans conceived of time. Without formal measurement, the pause of the sun offered a natural marker, a moment to distinguish one cycle from another. The year, previously experienced as an unbroken sequence of cold and warmth, could now be perceived as a series of stages, each with its own character and challenges. The longest night became a reference point for memory, planning, and reflection. Even if humans could not name it, they recognized it as a threshold between decline and return, between fear and cautious optimism. The solstice gave structure to lived experience, a sense that the universe operated according to patterns that could, eventually, be anticipated. Observation of the environment deepened during this period. Early humans noted the subtle behaviors of animals, the shifting positions of stars, the slow lengthening of shadows at dawn. Each small signal was a confirmation that the sun's retreat had reached its limit. The interplay between light and darkness, warmth and cold, life and hardship, was no longer chaotic. It had become a narrative that humans could perceive, internalize, and respond to. In this way, the solstice was both practical and spiritual. It provided information for survival while simultaneously offering a quiet, profound reassurance. The world was cyclical, and cycles implied continuity, endurance, and eventual renewal. Emotionally, the solstice was charged with tension and release. The long nights had cultivated anxiety, fear, and even despair, but the pause of the sun suggested that these states were temporary. Humans experienced a complex mixture of relief, wonder, and still uncertain hope. The realization that the sun had reached its nadir and would begin to return was not immediate joy, but a quiet, deep understanding that the worst moment had passed. This emotional nuance would echo through millennia, forming the basis of later rituals, myths, and celebrations. The psychological architecture of human culture, the capacity to mark and respond to turning points, was being constructed in these small, silent acknowledgments of natural rhythm. The solstice also encouraged introspection. The longest night was a natural mirror for the human condition, reflecting fears, vulnerabilities, and endurance. Sitting in darkness, watching the fire, observing the subtle shifts in the environment, humans were forced to confront their own fragility. Yet it was precisely this confrontation that allowed for growth. The solstice offered a liminal space, a pause in which the mind could process experiences, recognize patterns of survival, and begin to consider not only the external world but the inner one as well. The recognition that the sun would return mirrored the possibility of personal resilience, of recovery from hardship, and of the continuation of life despite adversity. Over generations, the knowledge gained from these observations became embedded in cultural memory, transmitted through stories, gestures, and early symbolic practices. Even before formal rituals or structures existed, the solstice was internalized as a recurring moment of significance. It was an experiential truth rather than a written one, a rhythm to live by rather than a rule to follow. Humans learned to anticipate it, to prepare for it, and to recognize its emotional and practical implications. In doing so, they were laying the groundwork for later forms of spirituality, ritual, and communal understanding of time. The solstice taught patience, attentiveness, and reverence for patterns larger than any individual. The environment itself reinforced these insights. The cold, the ice, the frost, and the snow became more than mere obstacles, they became markers of time and rhythm. Animals that survived, plants that endured, and even the slow arc of the sun across the horizon were read as signs in a living landscape. Humans were no longer passive inhabitants, they were attentive participants in an interconnected system. The solstice was the point at which this awareness became particularly acute, a pivot in perception that demonstrated the link between observation, survival, and emotional understanding. In essence, the solstice before it had a name was the first recognition of cycles as enduring, reliable phenomena. It revealed to humans that even in moments of extreme darkness, there was a turning, a limit, a moment when the tide would shift and the sun would rise again. This insight was foundational, not only for survival but for the development of human consciousness itself. The ability to perceive, internalize, and respond to cycles laid the cognitive and emotional groundwork for storytelling, ritual, and spiritual practice. The solstice became a teacher, instructing through experience rather than words, shaping minds and cultures in ways that would resonate for tens of thousands of years. Through endurance, careful observation, and shared attention, early humans began to sense the universe as a system, a rhythm, and a source of meaning. The pause of the sun was not just a moment in time, it was a lesson, a mirror, and a quiet reassurance that the world, for all its hardships, remained orderly and predictable in ways that mattered. From this recognition emerged the first stirrings of what we might call spiritual awareness, an intuitive understanding of cycles, resilience, and the possibility of renewal. In these long, frozen nights, before words could capture it, humans learned one of the most profound truths they would ever know, that darkness, no matter how deep, has a boundary, and that endurance through it reveals the promise of light. The fire was more than a source of warmth. It was a guardian, a companion, a fragile line between life and the encroaching cold. On the longest nights, when darkness stretched across the land like a heavy cloak and frost glazed every surface, people gathered close to the flames, huddled together for both protection and comfort. The fire's glow illuminated faces, revealing every line of fatigue, worry, and vigilance etched into skin hardened by wind and cold. Shadows danced along cave walls, across the snow, across the rough textures of wood and stone. Those flickering shapes seemed alive, moving independently of the humans who cast them, and in that movement, something ineffable stirred in the mind, a recognition that life persisted even when the world felt still and dangerous. Survival demanded attention. The fire required constant tending, new wood had to be added, embers stirred, smoke directed away from the circle of warmth. Flames could die quickly if neglected, leaving those near them vulnerable to the cold and the predators that prowled the night. Yet tending the fire was not merely a practical task. It became a ritual, an act of focus that reinforced connection and vigilance. Every motion, every careful placement of a log, every adjustment of embers, was a statement: we are still here. We endure. We persist. This quiet assertion of life was repeated countless times over millennia, embedding itself into the psychological architecture of human culture and creating an intimate relationship between humans and their environment. Around these fires, communities shared more than warmth. They shared stories, a form of communication that transcended mere survival instructions. Narratives were told in low voices, often interrupted by attentive glances toward the darkness beyond the firelight. These stories were fragments of memory, observations of the natural world, and imaginings of forces unseen but felt. The long nights offered both the time and the necessity for this transmission of knowledge. Storytelling reinforced group cohesion, passed survival strategies from one generation to the next, and provided a subtle training in emotional resilience. In recounting dangers faced and overcome, early humans not only educated their young but also rehearsed courage, patience, and hope. The act of storytelling in these contexts was as much about emotion as about information. The firelight magnified faces, gestures, and expressions, making communication intensely intimate. Fear could be shared and processed collectively. Anxiety could be transformed into understanding. Laughter, rare and precious in the cold, became a communal balm, breaking the tension of the long night. Humans learned to synchronize their emotional rhythms, to anticipate reactions, and to comfort one another without words at times, through posture, touch, or eye contact. In this crucible of extreme conditions, empathy, attention, and social intelligence were sharpened, as critical to survival as any physical skill. The environment outside the firelight shaped this interaction as much as the fire itself. Wind howled through openings, snow shifted against shelters, and distant sounds, wolves, deer, creaking branches, reminded humans that the world beyond their circle was unpredictable and dangerous. Within the fire's glow, humans could create a controlled space, a sanctuary against chaos, but it was a fragile one. Every member of the group had a role, whether tending the flames, keeping watch, or simply remaining alert. This collaboration was both practical and symbolic. It was an enactment of interdependence, a recognition that survival was a collective endeavor. The fire did not exist in isolation, nor did humans. Both were part of a web of attention, care, and shared responsibility. Sensory experience was heightened around these fires. The warmth contrasted sharply with the penetrating cold just beyond the flames, making every breath, every movement, more vivid. The smell of burning wood, the crackle of embers, the shifting shadows, all combined to create a heightened state of awareness and presence. These sensory elements reinforced memory, perception, and emotional resonance. Even the smallest details could signal danger or comfort: a log falling too loudly, a sudden gust of wind, the smell of smoke drifting in a particular direction. Humans became attuned to minute variations, their senses both practical tools and pathways to imagination. Shadows suggested movement, but they also suggested stories, imagined beings, or the possibility of unseen forces shaping the world. In this interplay of perception and imagination, the seeds of spiritual awareness and symbolic thinking took root. The fire also mediated time. In the absence of clocks or calendars, the rhythm of tending flames, the rise and fall of embers, and the duration of shared activities helped structure the night. Humans could measure intervals, anticipate moments, and organize group behavior through these cues. Rituals, whether formalized or improvised, emerged naturally from this temporal awareness. Lighting a new section of wood, stirring embers, or moving closer to the flames at intervals created repeated actions that anchored the mind in the passage of time. In this way, fire became both a practical necessity and a tool for cognitive and social development, shaping early human perception of continuity, sequence, and pattern. Yet there was also a psychological dimension to this intimacy with fire. The flames offered a sense of agency in an otherwise uncontrollable world. Humans could influence the immediate environment, they could make light, produce warmth, and create a protective circle. Even as the vast darkness beyond the fire remained indifferent, within its glow, humans exerted mastery, however fragile. This sense of control was emotionally vital, especially during the longest nights when the external world seemed relentless. It provided reassurance, reduced anxiety, and allowed the imagination to flourish without being entirely consumed by fear. In tending the fire, humans practiced resilience, agency, and hope, learning that even small acts could shape experience and meaning. Communal observation of the fire also reinforced understanding of the natural world. Flames highlighted textures, revealed footprints in the snow, and illuminated nearby vegetation. By watching how fire interacted with its surroundings, humans learned principles of heat, combustion, and material behavior. These insights were practical for survival but also contributed to abstract thinking. Observing cause and effect in a controlled, yet natural, context allowed humans to extrapolate patterns, anticipate consequences, and experiment mentally. Knowledge gained in this intimate setting extended beyond immediate survival, laying cognitive groundwork for later technological and cultural development. The interplay of fear, comfort, and reflection around the fire fostered emotional complexity. Humans learned to tolerate tension and uncertainty while maintaining cohesion and calm. They discovered that collective presence could transform anxiety into reassurance, that silence could be shared without alienation, and that even the smallest glimmer of light could anchor hope. Over time, these experiences around the fire became encoded in memory, ritual, and narrative. The fire's glow illuminated not only the physical environment but also the human psyche, teaching endurance, empathy, attentiveness, and the beginnings of symbolic thought. In this crucible of cold and darkness, humans began to understand that survival was not only about strength or skill but also about perception, emotion, and shared experience. The fire's role extended to social identity as well. By gathering around the flames, humans reinforced bonds, hierarchies, and communal norms. Those who tended the fire demonstrated skill and responsibility, gaining respect and trust. Elders who shared stories transmitted knowledge and values. Children learned not only practical skills but also the rhythms of emotion, attention, and social behavior. In this way, the fire became a center for cultural transmission, a living classroom that shaped cognition, behavior, and the capacity for imagination. Even the simplest observations around the fire carried profound implications. A shadow moving across the wall could inspire caution, a story could instill courage, a shared laugh could solidify bonds. These small interactions were practice in survival, yes, but also practice in emotional intelligence, creativity, and spiritual awareness. The fire created a microcosm in which humans could experiment with perception, sociality, and reflection, preparing them for a world that was otherwise unpredictable, harsh, and indifferent. In enduring the longest nights together, humans discovered resilience and continuity. The fire illuminated not only the immediate circle of survival but also the broader truths of existence, that darkness could be confronted, that agency existed even in limited forms, that shared vigilance and attention produced safety and insight. Through tending flames, sharing stories, observing shadows, and maintaining warmth, humans engaged in an early form of ritualized life, a practice that bound survival to emotional, social, and spiritual growth. In this crucible, the foundations of human culture, imagination, and inner renewal were forged, preparing each generation to face the cold, the dark, and the unknown with attention, courage, and hope. Caves were more than shelter, they were wombs of the earth, spaces that invited humans to enter darkness deliberately, to sit within it and confront both the external cold and the internal landscape of thought and feeling. For early humans, the long nights of winter demanded more than fire and food, they demanded a reckoning with uncertainty, mortality, and the fragility of life. In caves, shielded from wind and snow, they could pause, observe, and endure. The act of entering a cave was both practical and symbolic. The stone walls enclosed the body, but they also enclosed the mind, creating a space where reflection, ritual, and the beginnings of spiritual understanding could take root. The cave became a mirror of the world outside, dark, still, imposing, yet filled with possibilities for those who dared to look inward. Within these subterranean spaces, humans discovered the power of stillness. The air was cooler, heavier, and often carried the scent of smoke, damp stone, and earth. Sound behaved differently, footsteps echoed faintly, dripping water rang with clarity, and even a whisper could travel unnaturally far. This altered sensory environment sharpened perception. Every movement, every sound, every flicker of firelight became meaningful. Humans learned to attune themselves to subtle signals, to distinguish between danger and benign noises, to interpret patterns in ways that went beyond immediate survival. In the process, they cultivated attention, patience, and the capacity for observation that would shape their relationship with the natural and symbolic world. The darkness of the cave offered a unique kind of meditation. Unlike the external night, which was filled with unpredictable movement and threat, the cave provided a controlled void. Here, the mind could wander freely, yet safely. Early humans could sit for hours, days even, observing the shadows cast by their fires and their own bodies, noticing shapes and textures that seemed to emerge from the walls themselves. This interplay between perception and imagination began to shape symbolic thought. The same shadows that might have once inspired fear became canvases for understanding the unknown, rehearsing myths, or envisioning forces beyond immediate comprehension. The cave was not merely a physical refuge, it was an incubator for cognition and imagination, a place where inner life could flourish in the absence of sunlight. Art began to emerge in these spaces, even in its earliest, simplest forms. Marks on stone, scratches in the wall, pigments mixed from earth and charcoal, these were not decorations in the modern sense. They were manifestations of observation, ritual, and memory. Each symbol, each pattern, encoded knowledge and experience, bridging the inner and outer worlds. The walls of caves became records of survival, tools for teaching, and expressions of human consciousness. The act of creating within the cave, whether through drawing, carving, or arranging objects, allowed humans to externalize thought and emotion, transforming intangible experience into material form. In doing so, they forged a connection between the cyclical rhythms of nature and the inner rhythms of human awareness. Caves also functioned as communal spaces, yet the community that gathered there was not always large. The long nights demanded focus, and small groups could maintain vigilance while fostering intimacy. Fires, carefully tended, provided warmth and light, while rituals, whether singing, chanting, or silent reflection, reinforced social cohesion. The collective experience of darkness, observation, and endurance created shared psychological and emotional frameworks. Knowledge, values, and stories were transmitted in these spaces, binding generations together through common understanding and experience. In a world dominated by uncertainty, the cave offered continuity and connection, a space in which humans could collectively interpret both their environment and their internal lives. The symbolism of entering a cave resonated with deeper meanings. Descending into darkness mirrored the cyclical patterns of the natural world, particularly the retreat of the sun during the solstice. Just as the world outside grew colder and darker, humans voluntarily moved into a space of shadows and silence. This act of intentional descent was a kind of initiation, a practice of endurance and reflection. By confronting darkness directly, humans cultivated resilience, insight, and patience. The cave became a site where the internal and external converged, where the rhythms of the universe could be mirrored in the rhythms of the mind, and where the mysteries of life, death, and renewal could be contemplated in a tangible, experiential way. Within these spaces, humans also confronted mortality. The fragility of life, emphasized by hunger, cold, and predation, was reflected in the stillness and permanence of the stone around them. Yet mortality was not met with despair alone, it was contextualized within cycles of renewal. The cave itself, enduring and ancient, symbolized continuity and persistence. Humans could see themselves as temporary inhabitants of a longer, enduring world, and the darkness of the cave became a metaphor for both the unknown and the transformative potential of inner life. Here, the first spiritual insights were forged, that life and death, darkness and light, fear and hope, were intertwined aspects of existence, and that inner strength and reflection could illuminate the path through uncertainty. Observation continued within the cave, not only of the physical environment but of the self. Humans began to notice their own reactions to darkness, cold, and confinement. Emotional states, bodily sensations, and mental patterns became as significant as external threats. This introspection allowed early humans to develop a rudimentary sense of self-awareness, the capacity to monitor their own thoughts and feelings, and the ability to imagine outcomes beyond immediate survival. The cave created conditions for the emergence of inner life as a conscious, intentional experience. Reflection, memory, and imagination intertwined, giving rise to practices and behaviors that would later inform ritual, art, and spiritual contemplation. The cave also mediated the relationship between humans and time. Inside, external cues of day and night, temperature, and weather were diminished or transformed. The passage of time became linked to fire cycles, communal activity, and the cadence of shared rituals. Humans could measure duration, anticipate events, and establish rhythms independent of the sun's movement. This control over perception of time reinforced a sense of agency and continuity. It allowed for planning, teaching, and reflection, and it made possible the development of concepts such as cyclical renewal, endurance, and the long-term patterns that structured life and survival. Through repeated experience, caves became sacred spaces in the minds of humans long before formal religion emerged. The combination of shelter, darkness, observation, and community transformed these physical structures into loci of meaning. Humans began to understand that entering the cave, sitting with the fire, and observing shadows and sensations was itself an act of renewal. Endurance through darkness mirrored the solar cycles, teaching that patience, attention, and reflection were as critical as strength and skill. In this sense, caves were not just places to survive, they were spaces where humans rehearsed inner life, encountered the unknown safely, and developed the foundations of spiritual thought. The interplay of inner and outer experience within caves allowed humans to confront both fear and possibility. The darkness outside the cave represented uncertainty, but the darkness within could be navigated with intention. Shadows could be read, movements anticipated, and imagination exercised. The stone walls absorbed and reflected human presence, creating an environment that was simultaneously protective and instructive. Over time, these experiences were encoded into social memory, shared stories, and eventually ritualized practices. The cave became a teacher, a mirror, and a crucible in which human consciousness and spiritual awareness were forged. In these spaces, early humans discovered a fundamental truth: inner life, reflection, and renewal were as necessary for survival as food, fire, and warmth. Enduring darkness, observing carefully, and participating in communal vigilance created both practical and emotional resilience. The cave became a place where the rhythms of the world could be mirrored in the rhythms of human experience, where fear could be confronted safely, and where imagination and symbolic thought could emerge. From these early interactions with stone, shadow, and silence arose the first understanding of cycles, renewal, and the potential for inner transformation. The cave, enduring and patient, held within it the blueprint for human spirituality, cognition, and emotional depth, offering lessons that would resonate across generations and shape the very way humans perceived themselves in relation to the cosmos. Death in the prehistoric world was not a distant abstraction, it was an ever-present reality, a shadow that moved alongside every human life. Life was fragile, shaped by cold winters, scarce food, predators, and disease. Every day carried the risk that someone, child, adult, elder, would not survive the night. And yet, in the midst of such pervasive vulnerability, humans developed ways to process mortality, to integrate it into their understanding of existence. Death was not merely an ending, it was a transition, a part of the rhythm of life, and one that could be observed, honored, and contemplated even by those living in its shadow. Burial practices reveal the earliest attempts to make sense of death and to create continuity between the living and the dead. Graves were often shallow, simple, yet deliberate. The placement of bodies within the earth, the inclusion of stones, ochre, or personal belongings, suggests that humans understood death as something more than physical cessation. Even if the afterlife, as we conceive it today, did not exist, there was recognition that the deceased retained a presence, a memory, an influence, a lingering connection to the world of the living. These early practices were infused with meaning, emotional and symbolic, laying the foundation for later rituals, ceremonies, and spiritual beliefs. In the context of the solstice, death took on particular resonance. Winter represented scarcity, darkness, and hardship. The longest nights were a constant reminder of vulnerability. When someone passed during these months, the emotional weight was amplified. But it was also a period when the living became acutely aware of endurance, resilience, and the cyclical nature of existence. Just as the sun paused before returning, so too might life continue in subtle ways. The community's attention to the deceased during these dark months was a reflection of both mourning and hope, a recognition that even in endings, there could be continuity. The act of burying the dead was a communal experience. Bodies were not abandoned, they were prepared with care, sometimes wrapped in hides or placed in protective positions. The inclusion of tools, ornaments, or pigments was not mere decoration, it was a statement of identity, an acknowledgement that the person's life had meaning beyond the material world. Children observed these rituals, elders guided them, and the entire group participated in the acknowledgement of loss. Through these actions, humans learned to navigate grief collectively, to honor memory, and to integrate the inevitability of mortality into the rhythm of social life. Observing death and participating in burial also had psychological significance. It allowed humans to confront fear in a structured way, transforming anxiety about mortality into shared understanding and action. The physical act of handling the body, preparing it, and placing it into the ground provided a tangible method for processing what was otherwise incomprehensible. These practices created a bridge between the emotional, cognitive, and social dimensions of human life, offering a model for resilience and adaptation. In the midst of pervasive uncertainty, rituals surrounding death provided a framework for continuity, teaching that the cycle of life included both endings and renewal. Color and symbolism often accompanied these practices. The use of red ochre, for instance, appears in many early burials, applied to bodies, stones, or grave sites. The choice of color, though its meaning cannot be known with certainty, suggests an early human attempt to convey significance beyond the immediate and material. Red, resembling blood, may have symbolized life, vitality, or continuity. Its inclusion in the burial process indicates that humans were beginning to encode abstract ideas into material practices, linking mortality with symbolism and imagination. These acts transformed death from a purely biological event into a social and spiritual phenomenon, shaping how humans related to the world and to each other. Community presence during death served multiple functions. It reinforced social bonds, creating shared experiences of grief and remembrance. It transmitted cultural knowledge and values, ensuring that children and younger members learned appropriate responses to loss. It also reinforced patterns of observation and interpretation that were central to survival. Humans, by attending to the dead, were practicing attention, care, and ritual, skills that would later be applied to the living, the environment, and the cycles of the cosmos. Death became a teacher, instructing in both the fragility of existence and the resilience required to endure it. Even without formalized spiritual beliefs, early humans demonstrated an intuitive sense of continuity. Graves were often revisited, offerings added, or stones rearranged, suggesting that the dead were not forgotten entirely. Memory was active, the presence of the deceased influenced behavior, storytelling, and community identity. In this way, mortality was integrated into the daily and seasonal rhythms of life, reinforcing the idea that survival was not just biological but emotional and social as well. Endurance through loss, reflection on mortality, and care for the dead became intertwined with the practical necessities of living in a harsh, unpredictable world. The experience of death also shaped early humans' perception of time. Seasonal cycles, particularly the solstice, framed the rhythm of life and death. The longest nights were times of vulnerability, reflection, and ritual. By marking death within these cycles, humans could conceptualize life as part of a larger pattern, a rhythm that included darkness, endurance, and renewal. Even in despair, there was a recognition that endings were not absolute, that life, memory, and community persisted, and that survival depended on the integration of loss into ongoing existence. Emotional resilience was cultivated through these practices. Witnessing the mortality of others, participating in burials, and observing the care given to the dead trained humans to balance grief with hope, fear with endurance. These experiences reinforced the social and psychological skills necessary for survival: empathy, patience, attention, and foresight. Humans learned that mortality, though unavoidable, did not necessitate despair. It could be acknowledged, ritualized, and woven into the fabric of communal life. Through these early encounters with death, humans were also learning the first forms of symbolic and spiritual thought. The recognition that a person's essence, memory, or influence might continue after their physical body had vanished introduced the idea that life extended beyond immediate perception. This concept, initially practical and emotional, would later evolve into complex beliefs about the afterlife, spiritual continuity, and the sacred. Even in the absence of language capable of articulating such ideas fully, humans were beginning to conceptualize existence as layered, cyclical, and meaningful, linking mortality to endurance, memory, and hope. Death in the context of early human life was therefore not merely an event but a lens through which humans understood existence itself. Each loss was a meditation on vulnerability, resilience, and the interplay between life and the natural world. Burials, rituals, and observation encoded practical survival skills, emotional intelligence, and symbolic reasoning. The community's response to death, especially during the longest nights and darkest seasons, reinforced patterns of care, attention, and reflection that were essential for continuity. In confronting mortality directly, humans began to cultivate the inner strength, emotional depth, and social cohesion that would allow them not only to survive but to perceive life as part of a larger, enduring cycle. Through this early engagement with death, humans learned that endings were part of continuity, that darkness could be endured, and that survival required both action and reflection. Mortality became a teacher, guiding behavior, shaping culture, and fostering spiritual awareness. The interplay of life, death, and community during these harsh, cold months provided a foundation for understanding cycles, resilience, and the profound emotional and symbolic architecture of human existence. From this understanding, humans began to perceive that death, like the longest night, was not a finality but a stage within a larger rhythm, a rhythm that carried the promise of return, renewal, and the enduring presence of life beyond immediate sight. The forest in winter is a place both hostile and mesmerizing, a landscape sculpted by frost, wind, and snow. Every tree, every branch, every frozen puddle carries the weight of survival, of cycles endured across generations. For early humans, the forest was more than a resource, it was a living, breathing environment that demanded attentiveness, respect, and imagination. To navigate it successfully required skill, observation, and the ability to anticipate change. It also required courage, for every shadow could conceal predators, and every sound could signal danger. Yet within this harshness, humans began to perceive patterns, rhythms, and connections that extended beyond immediate survival, shaping an understanding of the world that was as emotional and spiritual as it was practical. Hunting in the winter forest demanded extraordinary focus. Tracks in the snow, subtle disturbances in the underbrush, and the faintest sounds became critical signals. Early humans learned to read these signs, to interpret meaning from minimal evidence, and to anticipate the movements of animals over vast distances. Every successful hunt was not simply a matter of physical skill but of perception, patience, and understanding the environment as a complex, dynamic system. Failure was not merely disappointment, it was a threat to survival. Yet these challenges fostered attentiveness and ingenuity. Humans developed tools, strategies, and collective coordination to navigate the forest effectively, learning lessons that extended far beyond immediate necessity. The winter forest also demanded cooperation. Hunting large game required multiple people working in concert, sharing knowledge, signals, and strategies. Silence and communication, observation and intuition, became intertwined. Humans learned not only to respond to the environment but to anticipate and influence it through collective action. The forest, in this sense, was both a teacher and a crucible. It shaped social bonds, honed cognitive skills, and fostered the earliest forms of strategic planning. Humans discovered that survival depended not only on individual strength or cunning but on the capacity to act as a cohesive unit, to read both the environment and one another with precision and trust. Yet the forest was not merely a site of danger and necessity, it was also a source of wonder. The play of moonlight on snow, the gleam of frost on branches, and the distant call of an owl or wolf inspired awe and reflection. Humans began to notice the beauty in these fleeting phenomena, perceiving patterns and rhythms that suggested order and coherence beyond immediate need. This aesthetic perception, subtle though it was, laid the groundwork for symbolic thought and spiritual awareness. Nature, though harsh, was also meaningful. The forest contained lessons not only for survival but for reflection, imagination, and understanding the cycles of life and death. The interaction with the winter forest also shaped early humans' conception of time. Seasonal changes were stark and undeniable, the shortening of days, the lengthening of nights, the freezing and thawing of rivers. These shifts demanded adaptability but also offered structure. Humans learned to anticipate patterns, to prepare for scarcity, and to interpret subtle environmental cues. The forest became a calendar of sorts, a living record of cycles that could be read through careful observation. Awareness of these cycles was not abstract, it was embedded in daily practice, hunting strategy, foraging, and movement. Over generations, these lessons formed the basis for a deep understanding of temporal rhythms, linking environmental change to human action, reflection, and planning. The forest also nurtured imagination. Shadows cast by trees, the movement of animals, the play of wind and snow created shapes and patterns that invited interpretation. Early humans, attuned to subtle cues, began to see connections and assign meaning where none might have been obvious. A rustle in the bushes could suggest a predator, yes, but it could also inspire stories or conjecture about forces beyond immediate perception. In this way, survival and imagination were inseparable. The mind learned to navigate real threats while simultaneously exploring possibilities, patterns, and unseen forces. Observation became both practical and symbolic, a dual skill that shaped cognition and emotional life. Solitude within the forest also had profound effects. While hunting or tracking alone, humans experienced an intimate connection to the environment. Sounds, scents, and visual cues were magnified, every movement mattered. In this heightened awareness, humans developed patience, attentiveness, and introspection. The forest required quiet and presence, teaching lessons that extended beyond hunting, the capacity to endure uncertainty, to anticipate change, and to navigate both external and internal landscapes. Solitude in the forest became a space for reflection, a precursor to meditation, and a foundation for later ritual and spiritual practice. The forest also reinforced social and cultural knowledge. Observing animal behavior, seasonal patterns, and plant cycles allowed humans to transmit information across generations. Knowledge about safe paths, hunting strategies, and edible plants was encoded in stories, gestures, and teaching practices. The environment became a living textbook, but one that required interpretation, attention, and imagination. In this way, the forest shaped not only survival but cognition, communication, and cultural continuity. Humans learned that understanding the environment was inseparable from understanding themselves and their community. Danger was constant in the winter forest, and it demanded vigilance. Predators, from wolves to large carnivores, prowled the landscape, while scarcity made encounters with other humans or rival groups tense and potentially deadly. Yet even amidst these threats, humans learned to integrate fear into cognition and action. Fear was not paralysis, it was a signal, a teacher, and a motivator. It sharpened senses, focused attention, and reinforced social cohesion. The forest, in this sense, was a mentor in vigilance, teaching humans to balance caution with exploration, anxiety with skill, and imagination with observation. The winter forest also shaped early humans' sense of ritual and symbolism. Certain places, clearings, groves, rivers, or rock formations, might have been noticed as significant, either for repeated patterns in animal behavior or for aesthetic and sensory impact. These spaces could become loci for observation, gathering, or symbolic action. The interplay of risk and beauty, danger and insight, created conditions in which humans began to attribute meaning to locations and events, laying the foundation for ritualized interaction with the environment. Space became more than physical, it became symbolic, narrative, and emotionally resonant. Through repeated interaction with the forest, humans began to perceive cycles beyond the immediate. The rhythm of snowfall, the return of certain animals, the lengthening of daylight after the solstice, all suggested that hardship was temporary, that endurance could be rewarded, and that the world followed patterns that could be observed and understood. This perception of continuity was crucial not only for survival but for psychological resilience. Humans began to internalize the idea that life operated in cycles, that periods of scarcity and danger were followed by renewal, and that understanding these rhythms allowed one to participate meaningfully in the broader patterns of existence. The winter forest also shaped early humans' emotional intelligence. Living in constant awareness of danger, scarcity, and environmental change required careful calibration of fear, patience, and social cooperation. Attention to subtle signals enhanced empathy, as group members learned to interpret each other's expressions, gestures, and reactions under stress. Collective presence in dangerous landscapes reinforced trust and coordination. Humans discovered that the emotional and cognitive skills honed in the forest were as critical to survival as physical strength, sharpening social intelligence, cooperation, and reflective capacity. Observation of the forest extended to its sensory richness. The sound of cracking ice, the scent of pine, the glint of frost on branches, the movement of clouds, all these phenomena were noted and interpreted. Early humans learned to associate patterns of sound, smell, and sight with outcomes, whether to predict weather, anticipate prey, or detect predators. Sensory awareness became intertwined with imagination, as patterns inspired stories, conjecture, and symbolic thinking. The forest was simultaneously a practical teacher and a canvas for reflection, creativity, and inner understanding. In these ways, the winter forest became a crucible of learning, imagination, and resilience. It demanded attention, cooperation, patience, and courage, while simultaneously inspiring awe, reflection, and symbolic thought. Humans learned to navigate danger, interpret patterns, and understand cycles, linking survival with cognition and emotional depth. The forest shaped not only practical skills but the capacity for imagination, social cohesion, and spiritual awareness. It taught lessons that extended beyond the immediate, embedding the principles of endurance, observation, and renewal into human consciousness. Through the constant interplay of risk, beauty, and insight, humans came to see themselves as participants in a world governed by patterns, rhythms, and cycles. The winter forest revealed that life, though fragile, was embedded in larger forces and that attention, endurance, and reflection could align human action with these rhythms. It was within this landscape, cold and harsh yet profoundly instructive, that early humans cultivated the skills, emotional intelligence, and imagination that would enable them to endure, interpret, and ultimately find meaning in the long nights and the cycles of existence. The turning of the seasons carried with it a quiet but profound weight, a rhythm that early humans felt in their bodies long before they could name it. As the solstice passed and the days began to lengthen imperceptibly, there was a subtle shift in the world. The frost that had coated branches began to soften, the snow that blanketed the ground started to glisten with hints of thaw, and the air, though still biting, carried the faint promise of change. Humans, attuned to these shifts through centuries of observation, sensed the return of light not merely as a physical phenomenon but as an emotional and spiritual one. The lengthening of the day was a reassurance that endurance had its reward, that the cycles of hardship and scarcity were giving way to renewal and possibility. This transition was not dramatic, it was measured, subtle, and required careful attention to perceive. Early humans learned to read signs in the environment, the behavior of animals emerging from their dens, the subtle changes in the movement of water under ice, the way certain plants began to show the faintest hints of vitality despite the cold. Each signal was observed, interpreted, and remembered, forming a cognitive map that integrated survival with anticipation. These observations were embedded not in written records, but in memory, storytelling, and repeated practice, linking generations through shared awareness of seasonal cycles. In this way, the turning of the year became a teacher, offering lessons in patience, attentiveness, and the rewards of careful observation. Emotionally, the return of light was profound. The long, dark nights had demanded endurance, creating tension, fear, and uncertainty. As the days lengthened, humans experienced a slow release of this tension, a subtle shift from anxiety to hope. The change was neither immediate nor absolute, it was incremental, unfolding over weeks. Yet within this gradual return, humans recognized patterns that reinforced resilience. The world, though harsh and unpredictable, was not chaotic. It moved in cycles that could be anticipated, understood, and respected. This recognition fostered a sense of continuity and security, shaping the earliest forms of philosophical and spiritual reflection. Hunting and gathering practices shifted in response to these changes. As daylight increased, animals altered their patterns, and humans adapted accordingly. New opportunities emerged, frozen rivers began to yield fish, tracks in softening snow revealed prey more clearly, and certain edible plants could be harvested as the earth showed signs of thaw. The changing landscape required vigilance and flexibility. Early humans developed strategies to exploit these opportunities while remaining cautious of lingering dangers. In doing so, they reinforced the link between observation, adaptability, and survival. The subtle environmental shifts demanded a combination of experience, attentiveness, and foresight, a cognitive engagement that sharpened skills essential for both immediate survival and long-term cultural development. The return of light also influenced social dynamics. As conditions became less harsh, communities could expand their range, engage in longer hunts, and gather in larger groups without the constant threat of hypothermia or scarcity. Social cohesion, reinforced during the dark months through collective vigilance and shared ritual, could now be expressed in expanded activity, teaching, and communal projects. Relationships were strengthened, stories shared with greater ease, and knowledge transmitted more effectively. The seasonal shift allowed humans to move from a survival-focused mindset to one that included planning, reflection, and symbolic engagement, laying the groundwork for complex cultural behaviors. Within these transitions, humans also experienced profound aesthetic and emotional resonance. The interplay of light and shadow on snow, the delicate shimmer of ice, the muted colors of winter slowly giving way to emerging vegetation, all these phenomena elicited a response that went beyond practical observation. Humans began to perceive beauty in change, to recognize patterns not solely for survival but for reflection and emotional engagement. This aesthetic awareness was closely intertwined with symbolic thought. Observing the return of light, witnessing the subtle transformations of the natural world, humans began to attach meaning to cycles, connecting external patterns with inner states of mind. The lengthening days became metaphors for hope, renewal, and resilience. Patterns in animal behavior were particularly instructive during this time. Prey species emerged from winter hiding, predator activity shifted, and birds returned or moved through migratory paths. Observing these behaviors allowed humans to anticipate outcomes, plan hunts, and refine tracking techniques. But the significance extended beyond practicality. The predictability of these patterns reinforced the idea that the world was governed by regularity and order, even amidst apparent randomness. Humans internalized these lessons, perceiving the larger rhythms that shaped both their environment and their lives. In doing so, they were building not only practical survival skills but cognitive frameworks for understanding time, cycles, and causality. The emotional impact of the return of light also nurtured psychological resilience. The long nights had been periods of heightened stress, fear, and vigilance. The gradual increase in daylight provided relief, a sense of reward for endurance, and the possibility of reflection without immediate threat. Humans experienced a layered emotional response, cautious optimism, awe at the persistence of natural cycles, and renewed energy to engage with the environment. These emotional experiences reinforced social bonds, as groups shared in observation, celebration, and practical activity. Endurance through darkness became meaningful, and the gradual return of light was a tangible affirmation of survival, continuity, and the efficacy of careful attention. As daylight extended, humans were able to observe subtler environmental phenomena that had previously been masked by darkness. The behavior of water, the movement of clouds, the early growth of vegetation, all became readable as patterns. Humans could detect signals that would inform future decisions about hunting, migration, and resource management. This expanded observational capacity was linked with reflection and memory, allowing knowledge to accumulate across seasons and generations. The return of light thus functioned as a teacher, revealing the complexity of the environment and encouraging humans to refine perception, reasoning, and interpretation. The cyclical return of light also carried implicit lessons about mortality and resilience. Just as the sun returned after the longest night, so too might life persist after hardship, scarcity, or loss. Early humans could draw analogies between environmental cycles and human experience, perceiving that endurance was rewarded and that transitions, though gradual, were inevitable. This understanding was not abstract, it was deeply embodied, reinforced through observation, labor, and reflection. It laid the foundation for ritual, storytelling, and philosophical reflection, linking external natural cycles with internal processes of growth, renewal, and adaptation. The gradual brightening of the landscape also encouraged experimentation and creativity. Humans could explore new territories, test new tools, and engage in behaviors that were previously too risky or resource-intensive during the darkest months. Observing these changes fostered problem-solving, anticipation, and innovation. Cognitive and cultural capacities expanded alongside environmental shifts, demonstrating the interdependence of survival, imagination, and reflection. Humans learned that attentiveness to cycles allowed them not only to endure but also to act proactively, shaping their environment and future outcomes. Furthermore, the subtle transformation of the world reinforced philosophical and emotional reflection. The return of light was a reminder that change is incremental, that endurance precedes renewal, and that observation and patience yield understanding. Humans were not passive recipients of environmental change, they were participants in a dynamic system, learning to align behavior with cycles, anticipate consequences, and interpret signs. The emotional and cognitive engagement fostered by these transitional periods shaped early human consciousness, reinforcing connections between perception, memory, and symbolic thought. By witnessing the world awaken gradually from winter's hold, humans were also learning to perceive causality and pattern on a scale larger than immediate action. The lengthening of days, the behavior of animals, the subtle growth of plants, all contributed to a framework of understanding that linked micro-observation with macro-patterns. Humans internalized these rhythms as both practical guides and metaphors, connecting survival with meaning, attention with reflection, and endurance with hope. Through the return of light after the solstice, early humans experienced more than environmental change, they experienced a cycle of renewal that resonated with emotional, cognitive, and spiritual dimensions. Observation, reflection, cooperation, and imagination were all reinforced through the subtle shifts in the landscape. Endurance through darkness had been necessary, but the gradual return of light offered affirmation, insight, and the possibility of planning for the future. Humans learned that the world, though harsh and unpredictable, followed rhythms that could be understood and integrated into lived experience. This understanding of cycles, continuity, and renewal formed a foundational element of early human consciousness. The return of light was both a practical signal for survival and a profound source of emotional and symbolic insight. By perceiving and responding to these transitions, humans cultivated attention, resilience, imagination, and social cohesion. They learned that endurance was not passive but active, that observation was not merely practical but deeply reflective, and that the natural world offered lessons that extended far beyond immediate survival. The gradual lengthening of days after the solstice became a template for understanding cycles in life, a mirror of human endurance, and an early teacher of hope, renewal, and inner transformation. The practice of ritual began not as ceremony but as an instinctive response to the cycles of the natural world and the rhythms of human life. Early humans, attuned to the subtle shifts of the seasons, the movements of animals, and the recurrence of environmental patterns, began to recognize that certain moments held significance beyond immediate survival. The solstice, the return of light, the first signs of thaw, all became focal points for observation, reflection, and communal action. Within these liminal moments, humans intuitively sought ways to mark, honor, and participate in the rhythms that governed existence. Ritual, in its earliest form, was a bridge between perception and meaning, connecting the outer world with inner life, danger with reflection, and endurance with hope. These early rituals were deeply tied to survival. Fire, already a source of warmth and protection, became central to collective action and symbolic practice. Around the flickering flames, humans gathered not only to cook or maintain heat but to enact behaviors that reinforced group cohesion, attention, and memory. Singing, chanting, and rhythmic movement emerged naturally from the necessity of collaboration and coordination, yet they also carried emotional and symbolic weight. The repetitive sounds and gestures heightened awareness, synchronized the group's attention, and created shared emotional experience. These acts, though practical in origin, laid the foundation for symbolic communication and the encoding of meaning through action. Observation and interpretation were central to these ritualized behaviors. Humans noticed the interaction of firelight with shadows, the patterns created by smoke rising into the cave, and the movement of their own bodies as they worked in concert. These interactions were meaningful on multiple levels. Practically, they reinforced focus and coordination. Emotionally, they produced awe, wonder, and reflection. Symbolically, they suggested a connection between human activity and the larger forces of the environment. The earliest rituals were not dictated by codified belief but emerged organically from attention to cycles, patterns, and relationships, forging a link between survival and consciousness. The solstice, in particular, offered a natural anchor for ritual. The longest night of the year, the nadir of sunlight, and the first hints of return combined to create a powerful liminal experience. Humans, having endured months of darkness, scarcity, and vigilance, were acutely aware of their own fragility and resilience. In this context, ritual became a means to acknowledge endurance, mark transitions, and prepare psychologically for the returning light. Actions such as lighting fires at specific intervals, arranging stones or objects in patterns, or performing coordinated gestures were embedded with intention, serving as both practical reinforcement and symbolic acknowledgement of the cycles of life. Ritual also provided a framework for social cohesion. In the harsh months of winter, attention to collective practices reinforced roles, responsibilities, and trust within the group. Elders guided the young, demonstrating techniques, recounting observations, and sharing stories of past survival. The repetition of these practices created a shared language of action and meaning, where gestures, sounds, and positions carried layered significance. Through ritual, humans could transmit knowledge, reinforce social bonds, and instill a sense of continuity and identity. These practices were foundational for the emergence of culture, memory, and symbolic reasoning. Material elements began to acquire symbolic importance within these practices. Stones, sticks, ochre, and other natural objects were arranged deliberately, marking locations, cycles, or events. These objects were not merely functional, they became extensions of human attention and intention, material embodiments of observation, memory, and reflection. Humans learned that manipulating the environment could encode meaning, communicate intentions, and create continuity between past, present, and future. Ritual, in this way, became a medium through which humans engaged with the world both practically and symbolically, experimenting with representation, abstraction, and relational understanding. Sound and movement were also central to early ritual. Chants, claps, or coordinated steps synchronized group behavior and heightened sensory engagement. These elements served practical purposes: communication across distance, coordination of hunting or defense, but also created a shared emotional resonance. Humans experienced collective rhythm, which reinforced social cohesion, focus, and emotional regulation. Repetition and pattern became psychologically grounding, providing stability in the face of uncertainty and enhancing memory. The auditory and kinesthetic dimensions of early ritual allowed humans to perceive relationships, sequences, and connections that extended beyond immediate survival needs. Emotion was inseparable from ritual. The solstice, with its long nights and gradual return of light, produced complex feelings of fear, hope, exhaustion, and anticipation. Ritual provided a safe space to express and process these emotions collectively. It transformed individual tension into shared experience, anxiety into reflection, and vigilance into coordinated attention. Humans learned that emotional states could be moderated through structured action, that fear could be integrated into understanding, and that joy, relief, and awe could be amplified through collective experience. Ritual, therefore, was both psychological and social, shaping cognition, emotion, and perception simultaneously. Ritual also reinforced temporal awareness. By marking the solstice or other cyclical events, humans created reference points within the passage of time. Fire, objects, songs, and gestures became temporal anchors, allowing humans to perceive continuity, anticipate recurrence, and plan behavior in relation to the environment. This awareness of cycles was critical for survival, informing hunting strategies, gathering practices, and social organization. Beyond its practical implications, temporal structuring through ritual cultivated a sense of permanence and connection, linking individual experience with communal memory and the broader patterns of nature. The spiritual dimension of early ritual emerged naturally from these practices. By aligning actions with cycles, humans began to perceive a relationship between their behavior and the larger forces governing life. Light, darkness, fire, and environmental change were experienced not merely as physical phenomena but as elements imbued with significance. Ritual created a medium through which humans could interact with these forces, negotiating survival while cultivating understanding and reverence. The boundary between practical action and spiritual reflection was fluid, attending to survival also attended to meaning, emotion, and cognition. Through repeated practice, ritual became anticipatory. Humans began to perform actions not only to address immediate conditions but to prepare for the future. Lighting fires in specific sequences, arranging objects, or performing coordinated gestures created patterns that could be repeated in subsequent cycles. These practices encoded knowledge, structured memory, and reinforced social cohesion. Humans learned that intention, repetition, and attention could shape both experience and perception, creating continuity across time. The earliest rituals were thus both pragmatic and symbolic, integrating survival, cognition, emotion, and reflection. The communal dimension of ritual also reinforced cultural transmission. Elders, who had observed countless cycles of solstice, winter, and renewal, guided younger members in the performance of these practices. Stories, gestures, and objects carried layered meanings that transcended immediate comprehension, linking generations in shared experience. Ritual became a vessel for memory, a tool for teaching, and a scaffold for symbolic thought. Humans were learning not only to survive but to encode knowledge, emotion, and observation in forms that could endure beyond individual life. Imagination and symbolism were inseparable from early ritual. Firelight reflected off walls, shadows danced in patterns, and objects were arranged deliberately to mark attention, intention, or memory. These sensory phenomena encouraged abstraction, pattern recognition, and symbolic thinking. Humans began to associate natural events with cycles of human experience, drawing parallels between endurance through darkness and the return of light, between scarcity and abundance, between life and death. Ritual became a rehearsal of meaning, a practice in aligning inner perception with external reality, and a foundation for spiritual awareness. The psychological impact of ritual was profound. Humans learned that structured action could moderate fear, channel energy, reinforce social cohesion, and deepen reflection. The solstice, with its extreme conditions and subtle promise of renewal, amplified these effects. Participating in collective attention, observation, and symbolic action created a sense of agency within a world that often felt uncontrollable. Humans discovered that they could participate in cycles, anticipate transitions, and engage meaningfully with the rhythms of life. Ritual, therefore, was not merely cultural decoration, it was an essential tool for cognition, emotion, and social survival. Through these practices, humans developed an early understanding of causality, pattern, and continuity. The repetitive, intentional, and communal nature of ritual highlighted the relationship between action and outcome, attention and result, observation and memory. By aligning behavior with environmental cycles, humans internalized principles of timing, pattern recognition, and symbolic meaning. Ritual became a medium for integrating perception, emotion, cognition, and social coordination, reinforcing resilience and the capacity for foresight. Ultimately, early ritual was a bridge between the tangible and the intangible. Actions, objects, sounds, and gestures were rooted in survival yet extended into the symbolic realm. Humans learned to mark cycles, honor endurance, and connect experience with meaning. The solstice, as a turning point in the year, became a focal point for these practices, linking environmental observation with emotional, cognitive, and social processes. Through ritual, early humans cultivated the skills, awareness, and symbolic capacity that would underpin later spiritual and cultural development. Ritual transformed ordinary moments into meaningful experience, survival into reflection, and observation into understanding. By participating in these collective, intentional practices, humans learn to endure darkness, anticipate change, and engage with both the world and themselves in profound ways. These early rituals were the scaffolding upon which culture, symbolic thought, and spiritual awareness would be built, offering lessons in resilience, continuity, and the capacity for inner transformation. The emergence of symbolic thought marked a profound transformation in human consciousness, one that unfolded gradually yet irrevocably across generations. Early humans, who had long been attuned to the rhythms of survival, began to perceive patterns not only in the physical world but in the interplay between their actions, their environment, and their own inner experiences. Shadows cast by firelight, footprints in the snow, the cry of an animal in the distance, each became more than a simple signal of danger or opportunity. These observations were internalized, interpreted, and layered with meaning. Humans began to recognize that the world was interconnected, that events were part of cycles, and that their actions could resonate beyond the immediate. Symbolic thought emerged as a bridge between observation and understanding, imagination and reality, survival and reflection. This capacity for abstraction allowed humans to begin encoding experiences into symbols, objects, and gestures. Simple markings on stone, arrangements of bones or stones, and the use of pigments such as ochre were not arbitrary. They represented attempts to externalize thought, to make the invisible visible, and to communicate ideas that could not be expressed solely through immediate action or speech. Each mark, each arrangement, became a vessel for memory, teaching, and communal understanding. Humans discovered that by creating symbols, they could extend cognition beyond the limits of individual perception, creating shared frameworks for understanding and acting in the world. The development of symbolic thought was inseparable from emotional experience. Early humans lived in an environment of constant uncertainty, where fear, hope, grief, and awe were daily companions. Symbolic expression allowed them to process these emotions collectively and individually, transforming raw sensation into reflection. A mark on a cave wall, the careful placement of a stone, or the use of color could encode not just observation but emotion, fear of predators, reverence for life, recognition of cycles, or anticipation of renewal. By embedding emotion within symbols, humans learned to navigate the complex interplay of internal states and external realities, developing resilience, insight, and empathy. Social cohesion was also reinforced through symbolic thought. Symbols created shared meaning, bridging individual perception with collective understanding. Storytelling, gestures, and material artifacts allowed humans to transmit knowledge, values, and experiences across generations. Children observing elders placing pigments or arranging objects absorbed not only technique but the underlying significance of these acts. Communities developed a common language of symbols, one that intertwined practical survival with reflection and imagination. The symbolic became a social glue, fostering trust, coordination, and shared purpose, while simultaneously encouraging individual cognitive growth and creative expression. The natural environment served as both inspiration and medium for symbolic thought. Patterns observed in the movement of the sun, moon, and stars, the migration of animals, and the cycles of vegetation were interpreted and abstracted into meaning. Humans began to draw analogies between natural phenomena and human experience, recognizing that endurance, renewal, and transformation were mirrored in both realms. The solstice, with its extremes of darkness and light, became a particularly potent symbol. The longest night and the return of the sun encapsulated ideas of death and rebirth, scarcity and abundance, fear and hope. Symbolic thought allowed these natural cycles to be internalized, reflected upon, and expressed in ways that transcended immediate survival. Ritual and symbolic thought were intimately connected. The repetitive and intentional actions that had emerged around fires, caves, and seasonal transitions were reinforced and enriched through symbolism. Objects, gestures, and patterns were imbued with meaning, transforming practical activity into contemplative practice. Humans began to perceive that certain actions could influence not just immediate outcomes but the alignment of themselves with larger cycles. Symbolic practices created a sense of agency within a world that often seemed uncontrollable, teaching humans that reflection, intention, and shared attention could shape perception, behavior, and emotional state. Language, in its earliest forms, was likely intertwined with symbolic thought. Words, sounds, and gestures became tools for representing not only objects and actions but also ideas, intentions, and abstractions. The interplay between speech, symbol, and action created a cognitive feedback loop. Humans could observe, encode meaning, communicate, and refine understanding collectively. The ability to discuss past events, anticipate future outcomes, and convey complex relationships enhanced social coordination, teaching, and cultural continuity. Symbolic thought and proto-language reinforced one another, expanding both practical capability and reflective depth. Memory played a critical role in the development of symbolic cognition. Observations of seasonal patterns, animal behavior, and environmental change were encoded not only in individual minds but in symbols, stories, and objects. This externalization of memory allowed humans to preserve knowledge across generations, to plan for future challenges, and to draw connections between events separated by time and space. By creating symbols, humans could navigate complexity, anticipate outcomes, and transmit understanding without reliance on immediate perception. Symbolic thought transformed experience into enduring knowledge, linking cognition, culture, and reflection in a powerful feedback loop. The emotional resonance of symbolic practices was profound. Humans began to perceive that meaning could be embedded in objects, actions, and patterns, and that engagement with these symbols could influence internal states. Observing the play of firelight on a painted wall, performing coordinated gestures, or arranging natural objects in meaningful sequences could evoke awe, reverence, or reflection. Symbolic thought provided a medium for aligning emotional experience with understanding, teaching early humans to integrate sensation, cognition, and social awareness. This capacity for emotional symbolic integration was critical for resilience, creativity, and the emergence of spirituality. Spatial awareness was enhanced through symbolism as well. Caves, clearings, riverbanks, and other meaningful locations were marked, remembered, and revisited. Objects placed deliberately in these spaces functioned as guides, records, or expressions of intent. Humans learned to navigate not only physical landscapes but symbolic landscapes, perceiving connections between location, experience, and meaning. This dual awareness, of external terrain and internal significance, sharpened cognition, planning, and social coordination. Symbolic engagement with space transformed survival into reflection, observation into memory, and action into meaning. Patterns became central to symbolic thought. Repetition, sequencing, and correspondence were observed in nature, fire, shadow, and animal behavior, and humans began to encode these patterns in symbols, rituals, and gestures. Recognizing pattern allowed humans to anticipate outcomes, interpret meaning, and create predictive models of the world. The ability to abstract patterns from observation and embed them into symbolic systems represented a profound cognitive advance, enabling early humans to perceive continuity, causality, and cycles beyond immediate experience. The integration of death, renewal, and survival into symbolic thought deepened understanding of existence. Burial practices, the marking of solstices, and attention to seasonal transitions provided material and conceptual anchors for abstract reasoning. Humans began to perceive life as cyclical, death as transformation, and endurance as both practical and moral. Symbolic representation allowed these insights to be encoded and shared, reinforcing social cohesion and preparing successive generations for challenges. The ability to represent and interpret these profound ideas marked a critical step in the evolution of culture, consciousness, and spirituality. Imagination flourished alongside symbolic thought. Early humans could envision outcomes, rehearse actions, and explore possibilities beyond immediate perception. The mind could manipulate symbols, anticipate consequences, and reflect on cycles and relationships. Symbolic engagement allowed humans to create narratives, interpret patterns, and integrate experience in ways that transcended immediate survival. Imagination became both a tool for planning and a medium for meaning-making, linking cognition, emotion, and social practice in an unprecedented manner. Through repeated interaction with symbols, humans developed complex temporal awareness. Understanding past events, anticipating seasonal change, and projecting future outcomes required sophisticated cognitive integration. Symbols, rituals, and stories provided scaffolding for this temporal reasoning, enabling humans to navigate uncertainty, plan strategically, and encode cultural knowledge. Symbolic thought thus became both practical and reflective, merging the demands of survival with the development of consciousness, culture, and philosophy. The social dimension of symbolism reinforced cohesion and identity. Shared symbols, rituals, and narratives created communal frameworks for understanding the world. Humans learned to interpret, respect, and respond to the symbolic actions of others, developing empathy, coordination, and collective meaning-making. Symbolic practices mediated relationships, taught attention, and reinforced shared understanding, linking individual cognition with community resilience. The interplay between symbol, action, and social interaction laid the groundwork for culture, morality, and spiritual awareness. Ultimately, the emergence of symbolic thought transformed human existence. Observation, reflection, emotion, and action were integrated into systems of meaning that extended beyond immediate survival. Humans could encode memory, transmit knowledge, anticipate cycles, and engage with both the tangible and intangible world. Symbolic thought allowed early humans to perceive continuity, pattern, and relationship, linking environmental observation with social cohesion, emotional resilience, and philosophical insight. It was within this developing symbolic framework that humans began to navigate not only the external world but the inner landscape of thought, reflection, and awareness. Through these capacities, humans were no longer merely reacting to the environment, they were participating in it intentionally, interpreting it, and embedding experience into enduring forms. Symbols became vessels of memory, emotion, and foresight. They transformed survival into meaning, observation into reflection, and action into insight. The emergence of symbolic thought was a turning point, creating the foundation for culture, spirituality, imagination, and the conscious understanding of life's cycles, mortality, and renewal. Early humans were learning to see not only the world but themselves within it, perceiving the continuity of existence and the possibility of inner transformation. The winter solstice had always held a quiet, almost mystical wait for early humans, yet it was not until the emergence of reflective consciousness that its significance deepened into something almost sacred. The longest night of the year, when darkness seemed to stretch endlessly across the land, forced humans to confront vulnerability and uncertainty with heightened awareness. The cold, the scarcity of food, the threat of predators, and the relentless passage of time converged into a crucible of experience that tested endurance, patience, and perception. Yet within this harsh reality, the solstice offered more than challenge, it offered insight. Humans began to recognize that the longest night was not only a literal marker of the season but a symbolic threshold, a liminal moment in which attention, reflection, and ritual could converge to create understanding and renewal. Observing the solstice required attentiveness honed over years of survival. Humans noticed subtle changes in the light, the angle of the sun, the patterns of shadows, and the behavior of animals. Deer might shift their grazing patterns, birds alter their flights, and the flow of rivers under ice subtly changed. Each cue was noted, interpreted, and remembered, providing critical information for hunting, gathering, and movement. But beyond the practical implications, these observations carried emotional and symbolic weight. The solstice was a time when humans felt the extremity of the environment and simultaneously sensed its continuity. The cycle of darkness and light became a mirror of human endurance, mortality, and hope. Communal gathering during the solstice reinforced social cohesion. Groups huddled around fires, sharing warmth, food, and stories. Elders recounted past experiences, teaching younger members to recognize patterns, anticipate cycles, and interpret environmental signals. Storytelling was not merely entertainment, it was a method of encoding survival knowledge and linking it with emotional and symbolic meaning. Tales of endurance, of animals tracked and captured, of storms weathered, and of nights survived formed a collective memory that reinforced identity, trust, and shared understanding. The solstice became both a practical and emotional anchor, a moment when human experience, reflection, and communal continuity intersected. Ritualized behaviors during the solstice emerged naturally from these shared experiences. Firelight, shadows, and spatial arrangements of objects were imbued with significance. Humans might arrange stones in patterns, leave offerings, or perform coordinated gestures that aligned with the cycles of the sun and moon. These actions were not arbitrary, they encoded attention, intention, and awareness into tangible forms. Performing these rituals collectively created shared understanding, heightened attention, and a sense of agency within an environment that could feel overwhelming. The solstice became a focal point for intentional action, blending survival with reflection, and observation with meaning-making. Symbolic thought intertwined seamlessly with solstice practices. The long night and the gradual return of light provided a powerful metaphor for cycles of life, death, and renewal. Humans began to internalize these rhythms, perceiving that endurance through darkness was rewarded with the return of illumination and warmth. Pigments, markings on stone, and arrangements of natural objects allowed humans to encode these observations and insights into durable forms. The solstice was not merely observed, it was enacted, rehearsed, and embedded into collective consciousness through symbols that bridged the tangible and the abstract. Emotion played a central role in the significance of the solstice. The extremity of darkness and cold heightened fear, anxiety, and vigilance, yet also sharpened awe, hope, and anticipation. Humans experienced the solstice as a layered emotional event, integrating the tension of survival with the relief and anticipation of the returning sun. Participating in communal observation, ritual, and symbolic practice allowed humans to regulate emotions, share experience, and reflect on the broader meaning of endurance. These emotional processes were inseparable from cognition and social cohesion, creating a foundation for reflective awareness, empathy, and spiritual insight. The solstice also functioned as a temporal anchor. By marking the longest night and observing the first return of light, humans could structure time, anticipate environmental shifts, and plan for future activities. These temporal patterns were crucial for survival, influencing hunting strategies, migration, and resource management. Beyond practicality, temporal awareness reinforced the perception of cycles in human life, linking endurance, mortality, and renewal. Recognizing the rhythm of the solstice allowed humans to situate themselves within a larger continuum, perceiving continuity and cultivating a sense of purpose within the unfolding cycles of existence. The natural environment during the solstice offered both challenge and instruction. Snow-laden forests, frozen rivers, and barren landscapes required vigilance, adaptability, and skill. Yet within these challenges were subtle cues, patterns, and signals that could be interpreted to guide action. Tracking animal behavior, observing the movement of clouds, and noting changes in ice or vegetation allowed humans to anticipate scarcity, opportunity, and danger. The solstice intensified the necessity for observation, reflection, and interpretation, reinforcing the integration of perception, cognition, and action. Humans learned that attentiveness to environmental cues was not only practical but also a conduit for understanding deeper patterns and cycles. The aesthetic dimension of the solstice was equally profound. The interplay of moonlight, frost, and shadow transformed the landscape into a canvas of ephemeral beauty. Humans noticed these details, internalizing patterns, forms, and rhythms that would inform both symbolic practice and emotional reflection. The sensory richness of the solstice, the crunch of snow underfoot, the glow of firelight on cave walls, the call of distant animals, created immersive experiences that blended observation, emotion, and imagination. These experiences fostered the capacity for abstraction, pattern recognition, and symbolic thought, linking survival with creativity, cognition, and meaning-making. Social learning during the solstice reinforced cultural continuity. Elders guided observation, teaching younger members to track environmental change, anticipate animal behavior, and participate in communal rituals. Knowledge was encoded not only in practical skills but in symbolic forms, gestures, and narratives. Children learned to associate endurance, reflection, and attention with reward and renewal. The solstice provided an annual opportunity for collective reinforcement of social structures, knowledge transmission, and the integration of practical and symbolic understanding. Human cognition, emotion, and sociality were all sharpened through participation in these cyclical, communal experiences. Symbolic and ritualized practices during the solstice also reinforced imagination and foresight. Humans could anticipate the gradual return of light, plan future hunts, and reflect on the patterns of the environment across time. These practices extended cognition beyond immediate perception, linking observation with prediction, experience with interpretation, and survival with reflection. The solstice became both a literal and metaphorical turning point, teaching that endurance, attention, and collective action could shape outcomes, reinforce understanding, and embed experience into durable forms of knowledge and meaning. Mortality and renewal were central themes during the solstice. The darkness emphasized vulnerability, scarcity, and the proximity of death, yet also underscored resilience and the inevitability of change. Humans internalized these lessons, linking survival with reflection and symbolic practice. Burial practices, observation of cycles, and participation in ritual allowed humans to integrate awareness of mortality with hope, endurance, and understanding. The solstice offered a natural stage for reflecting on the interplay between life, death, and renewal, deepening insight and reinforcing social and emotional cohesion. Through repeated observation and participation, the solstice became a scaffold for human consciousness. Attention to environmental patterns, symbolic expression, ritual, and emotion created a framework for understanding cycles, relationships, and continuity. Humans learned to navigate uncertainty, integrate emotional and cognitive experience, and participate in collective meaning-making. The solstice, in this context, was more than a seasonal marker. It was a teacher, a mirror, and a catalyst for the development of reflective awareness, imagination, and the earliest forms of spiritual cognition. The solstice also reinforced the interplay between individual experience and communal life. Each person's observation, reflection, and participation contributed to shared understanding. Collective rituals, storytelling, and symbolic practice strengthened bonds, transmitted knowledge, and embedded insight into the group memory. Humans discovered that survival, reflection, and meaning were not isolated pursuits, they were intertwined with attention to others, social cohesion, and the continuity of communal knowledge. The solstice, therefore, functioned as a focal point for both personal and collective transformation. Ultimately, the winter solstice became a lens through which early humans understood cycles of darkness and light, scarcity and abundance, mortality and renewal. Observation, reflection, and symbolic practice converged to create meaning, reinforce social cohesion, and cultivate resilience. Humans learned to anticipate change, encode experience, and integrate emotion, cognition, and action. The solstice was both practical and profound, a rhythm in the natural world that mirrored internal processes and inspired the earliest forms of spiritual, symbolic, and reflective awareness. Through these experiences, humans began to perceive themselves not as passive observers but as participants in a dynamic, interconnected world, capable of endurance, insight, and inner transformation. As the weeks following the winter solstice unfolded, early humans experienced a profound shift in both their environment and their perception of it. The faint lengthening of days brought subtle changes to light, temperature, and movement across the landscape. Ice began to soften along riverbanks, the snow crusting the forest floor gradually yielded to thaw, and small shoots of plants hinted at the promise of renewal. These shifts, though incremental, carried enormous significance. Humans, keenly attuned to the environment through centuries of survival, perceived not merely physical changes but the implications for sustenance, safety, and social organization. Every observation, an animal track partially revealed, a thawed patch of ground, the glimmer of sunlight on frost, became an opportunity to anticipate, plan, and reflect on both immediate survival and larger cycles of life. This period following the solstice was particularly rich for observation and learning. Humans began to track animal behaviors with increased precision. Prey species, emerging cautiously from their winter hiding places, moved in new patterns that could be anticipated with careful attention. Predators, likewise, adapted to the slightly longer days, adjusting hunting strategies and movements. Early humans integrated these observations into complex mental maps of the environment. Hunting strategies, foraging practices, and even decisions about temporary campsites were informed not only by immediate necessity but by an evolving understanding of cyclical patterns, interdependence, and environmental signals. Observation became both a practical tool and a medium for reflection on the rhythm of life. The return of light after the solstice had profound psychological effects. Months of darkness had fostered vigilance, caution, and emotional intensity. The gradual increase of daylight allowed humans to experience a release of tension, a subtle reassurance that endurance had its reward. This shift fostered hope, renewed energy, and a sense of possibility that went beyond physical survival. The incremental return of light also provided a mirror for internal cycles. Humans could draw analogies between the external environment and their own capacities for resilience, patience, and adaptation. Endurance through scarcity and danger became not only a matter of survival but a lived lesson in temporal continuity and inner strength. Social interactions intensified during this transitional period. As environmental conditions improved slightly, groups could engage in longer excursions, share more elaborate tasks, and reinforce social cohesion. Activities such as collaborative hunting, preparation of food caches, and repair or creation of tools were opportunities for teaching, learning, and reinforcing communal bonds. Elders demonstrated observation techniques, tracking strategies, and survival tactics, while children learned not only through instruction but through direct engagement with the environment. These interactions reinforced shared knowledge, social trust, and the integration of practical skill with reflection and imagination. Symbolic thought continued to deepen during this period. Humans began to associate specific environmental cues with cycles of fortune and challenge, encoding these patterns in objects, arrangements, and gestures. Stones might be placed to mark significant locations, pigments applied to surfaces to commemorate events, or gestures performed to signify anticipation of future changes. These symbolic acts were intertwined with observation, social cohesion, and emotional experience. They provided a medium through which humans could make sense of complex patterns, share understanding across generations, and internalize the rhythms of the environment in ways that were simultaneously practical, reflective, and emotionally resonant. The emotional landscape during this transitional period was intricate. Humans experienced relief at the return of light, hope for upcoming abundance, and lingering vigilance from months of scarcity. These emotions were not isolated, they were communal, shared through storytelling, coordinated activity, and ritualized behavior. The interplay of individual and group emotion reinforced attention, observation, and social cohesion. Humans learned to regulate anxiety through structured action, to transform fear into focused perception, and to amplify hope through collective anticipation. This emotional sophistication was crucial for both survival and the emergence of reflective consciousness. Observation of the natural world during this period was multidimensional. Humans tracked not only obvious signs such as animal tracks or weather changes but also subtle indicators, the quality of light, shifts in wind patterns, or the behavior of water under partial thaw. These observations were interpreted not in isolation but in relation to cumulative knowledge. Humans developed an intuitive understanding of cause and effect, pattern and consequence, scarcity and opportunity. This growing capacity for abstraction and inference laid the groundwork for complex problem-solving, symbolic reasoning, and the earliest philosophical reflection on the interconnectedness of life. Ritual practices, reinforced during the solstice, continued to play a role in the post-solstice period. Humans repeated and refined gestures, songs, and object arrangements that had initially been linked to marking time and endurance. These rituals provided continuity, memory reinforcement, and social cohesion. The repetition of symbolic action across cycles strengthened the capacity for foresight, reflection, and emotional regulation. By participating in these acts, humans were encoding knowledge, emotion, and expectation into tangible practices, integrating practical survival with cognitive and spiritual development. The return of light also enabled early humans to explore broader landscapes. Extended daylight provided opportunities to observe distant terrain, track migratory patterns of animals, and locate new resources. Humans could test tools, experiment with hunting strategies, and refine foraging techniques with greater safety and attention. These excursions were both practical and reflective, fostering problem-solving, spatial awareness, and environmental mastery. Humans learned that engagement with the world could be proactive, imaginative, and anticipatory, and that observation was inseparable from action, memory, and social cooperation. The cyclical nature of environmental change became increasingly evident. Humans could perceive that scarcity was temporary, that darkness gave way to light, and that perseverance was rewarded. This perception reinforced emotional resilience, patience, and hope. Endurance through hardship was not merely a matter of biology but of reflective practice, social cohesion, and attention to cycles. Humans began to internalize these rhythms, linking observation, memory, and symbolic thought to both immediate and long-term planning. The post-solstice period became a time of consolidation, reflection, and preparation, where past experience informed present action and anticipation shaped future strategy. Symbolic representations continued to deepen in complexity. Humans began to associate environmental cues with social and emotional significance. The sight of early shoots emerging through snow could be linked to hope and renewal, the appearance of prey animals to sustenance and survival, and the gradual return of light to endurance and reward. Objects, pigments, and gestures became more deliberately structured, forming patterns that conveyed layered meaning. This process reinforced memory, social cohesion, and reflective consciousness, allowing humans to integrate perception, emotion, and action in increasingly sophisticated ways. Memory and storytelling were central during this period. Elders recounted the events of previous cycles, teaching lessons about endurance, observation, and adaptation. Children observed and participated, absorbing not only techniques but also the symbolic and emotional significance of experience. Stories became repositories of knowledge, encoding environmental understanding, social norms, and emotional insight. Memory, ritual, and narrative converged, creating a shared cognitive and cultural framework that linked generations and embedded awareness of cycles, resilience, and renewal. The psychological impact of these post-solstice experiences was profound. Humans learned to perceive continuity within change, to recognize patterns across time, and to anticipate outcomes based on observation and memory. These cognitive skills were inseparable from emotional regulation, social cohesion, and symbolic understanding. The gradual return of light provided both literal and metaphorical illumination, reinforcing the link between external cycles and internal awareness. Humans developed the capacity to integrate fear, hope, and anticipation into structured thought and collective action, cultivating resilience, insight, and reflective consciousness. The interplay between environment, cognition, and emotion also fostered early spiritual awareness. Humans began to perceive that their experience was interconnected with larger cycles of life and death, scarcity and abundance, darkness and light. Symbols, rituals, and observation provided a means of engaging with these forces intentionally. The post-solstice period was a crucible in which humans could align action with reflection, perception with understanding, and endurance with hope. Spiritual awareness emerged naturally from this integration, rooted in observation, emotion, and participation in cyclical processes. By engaging with the environment in this attentive, reflective manner, humans developed an intimate sense of interconnection. The post-solstice landscape, though still harsh, offered insight into resilience, pattern, and relationship. Humans recognized that survival depended on integration of knowledge, memory, emotion, and collective coordination. Observation and reflection became inseparable from action, symbol, and social cohesion, creating a holistic understanding of existence that extended beyond immediate necessity. Through this period following the solstice, humans cultivated skills, awareness, and understanding that would shape the trajectory of culture and consciousness. Observation, symbolic thought, ritual, and social learning converged to reinforce memory, attention, and reflective practice. Humans learned to anticipate change, interpret patterns, and engage with cycles of life in ways that integrated survival, cognition, emotion, and social cohesion. The post-solstice period was not simply a transition in the environment but a crucible for internal transformation, a space in which humans began to perceive themselves as participants in a dynamic, interconnected world capable of renewal, insight, and deliberate action. Ultimately, this transitional period highlighted the profound interdependence of observation, reflection, emotion, and symbolic engagement. Humans learned that careful attention to cycles could guide action, that shared experience could reinforce resilience, and that symbols and rituals could encode both knowledge and meaning. The weeks following the solstice provided a foundation for understanding continuity, anticipating renewal, and integrating internal and external experience. Through these processes, early humans were not only surviving the world but beginning to interpret, reflect upon, and shape it in ways that were cognitive, social, and spiritual, laying the groundwork for the deeper symbolic and cultural practices that would define human experience for millennia to come. The approach of midwinter brought with it an unmistakable shift in the rhythm of human activity, a subtle yet profound transition that was felt as keenly in the mind as in the body. Days, though only marginally longer, carried a faint warmth and a promise of gradual renewal. The forest, once dominated by unbroken snow and ice, began to reveal hints of life beneath its frozen mantle. Small streams, previously locked in frost, gurgled faintly under the thinning ice, and the movement of birds signaled shifts in the patterns of migration and behavior. Early humans, whose survival depended on the precise reading of such changes, began to attune not only to the practical implications of these shifts but also to their symbolic and emotional resonance. The world, which had seemed dominated by darkness and scarcity, now suggested continuity, resilience, and possibility. Hunting during this transitional period demanded both skill and foresight. Prey species, sensing the subtle cues of lengthening days and the early signs of thaw, began to alter their behavior. Humans, keenly observant, tracked these changes with careful attention. Footprints in partially thawed snow, disturbed vegetation, and faint sounds in the underbrush provided essential clues. Successful hunting required not only physical ability but acute cognitive perception, memory, and interpretation of complex patterns. These observations were shared communally, ensuring that knowledge gained in one part of the territory could inform the actions of the group at large. The interplay of survival, observation, and communal learning reinforced the integration of cognition, social cohesion, and environmental awareness. Foraging also took on new dimensions. As frost retreated from the soil and ice receded from streams, early humans were able to access previously unavailable resources. Edible roots, early shoots, and small animals emerged as viable food sources. Humans quickly learned to interpret these signals, recognizing patterns of emergence, abundance, and scarcity. The act of foraging became both practical and contemplative, requiring careful attention, anticipation of future availability, and coordination within the group. These interactions reinforced memory, planning, and symbolic interpretation, as humans increasingly linked environmental cues with outcomes, reinforcing the cognitive scaffolding necessary for survival and reflective awareness. The psychological effects of this seasonal transition were profound. The months following the solstice had demanded endurance, vigilance, and heightened awareness. The incremental return of light provided subtle relief, fostering hope and renewed energy. Humans could perceive the gradual easing of environmental pressure, experiencing a corresponding relaxation in emotional tension. Yet this relief was not passive, it demanded continued attentiveness. The world was still harsh and unpredictable, and success required careful engagement with emerging patterns and subtle environmental cues. In this tension between relief and vigilance, humans honed the integration of emotion, cognition, and action, cultivating resilience, foresight, and reflective capacity. Social dynamics intensified as opportunities for cooperative action expanded. Longer daylight allowed groups to engage in more complex activities, such as coordinated hunting expeditions, communal foraging, and the construction or repair of shelters. These collaborative efforts reinforced trust, attention, and shared knowledge. Elders guided younger members, transmitting both practical skills and symbolic understanding. Knowledge of environmental patterns, seasonal cycles, and survival strategies was embedded in both instruction and action. These interactions reinforced the social scaffolding necessary for communal living, integrating cognition, observation, and emotional intelligence. Symbolic thought flourished alongside these practical engagements. Humans began to see deeper connections between events, actions, and cycles. The subtle cues of the environment, the first signs of thaw, the behavior of prey, the shifting quality of light, were interpreted not only as practical signals but also as meaningful phenomena. Objects, gestures, and pigments were employed to encode observation, memory, and emotional experience. The landscape itself became a repository of symbolic significance, where natural patterns were mirrored in social and reflective practices. Humans were learning to perceive the world as interconnected, dynamic, and meaningful, and to encode this understanding into durable forms of cognition and culture. Ritualized behavior continued to anchor human engagement with the environment. Fires, arranged stones, and repeated gestures created structure, continuity, and shared meaning. Humans enacted practices that had originated in solstice observances but now extended into the post-solstice period. These actions reinforced attention, memory, and collective awareness, linking observation with symbolic understanding. Participation in ritual allowed humans to process emotion, cultivate reflection, and strengthen social cohesion. The repetition of these practices across cycles encoded not only knowledge of survival but also the emerging capacity for abstract thought and spiritual awareness. Emotion remained central to perception and action. Humans experienced a complex interplay of hope, caution, curiosity, and anticipation. Relief at the returning light was tempered by recognition of ongoing challenges, cold, scarcity, and the need for vigilance. Social interaction provided both emotional support and a medium for processing these feelings collectively. Storytelling, gesture, and shared action created a communal emotional rhythm that reinforced memory, attention, and reflective capacity. The post-solstice period was thus a training ground for emotional regulation, empathy, and the integration of cognition and affect into coordinated survival strategy. Observation of natural patterns deepened during this phase. Humans noted subtle cues, the emergence of early shoots, the partial thaw of streams, the return of certain bird species, and shifts in the behavior of predators and prey. Each observation was integrated into a growing mental map of the environment, informing decisions about movement, foraging, and hunting. These insights were shared and reinforced communally, enhancing collective knowledge and facilitating anticipatory planning. Humans learned to perceive the interconnectedness of events, the significance of timing, and the value of pattern recognition, strengthening cognitive capacity alongside practical skill. The aesthetic qualities of the emerging landscape did not go unnoticed. Frost glinting on the edges of streams, the interplay of sunlight with snow, the subtle colors of early shoots, all contributed to heightened sensory awareness and reflective perception. Humans began to internalize these phenomena, linking observation with emotional response, symbolic interpretation, and imaginative engagement. Sensory experience became both a source of practical information and a medium for aesthetic and symbolic reflection, reinforcing the integration of cognition, emotion, and culture. Memory and storytelling continued to play a central role. Elders recounted prior cycles, teaching both technique and insight, linking environmental observation with emotional and symbolic understanding. Children participated, absorbing knowledge experientially and symbolically. Stories encoded patterns of survival, cycles of abundance and scarcity, and moral and emotional lessons. Memory, ritual, and narrative converged to create a durable cognitive framework, preserving knowledge across generations and embedding reflective awareness into the communal psyche. The development of symbolic and ritual practices during this phase facilitated imagination and foresight. Humans could anticipate future conditions, rehearse actions mentally, and engage with abstract concepts such as cycles, transformation, and continuity. Symbols and ritualized gestures acted as cognitive tools, scaffolding both memory and predictive capacity. This integration of observation, reflection, and symbolic practice enabled humans to navigate uncertainty more effectively, bridging immediate survival needs with long-term planning and understanding. The post-solstice period also reinforced awareness of mortality and renewal. The extreme darkness of prior weeks remained a memory, highlighting vulnerability and dependence on skill, cooperation, and observation. The return of light and early signs of life offered reassurance, teaching that cycles of scarcity and abundance, danger and safety, death and renewal were integral to existence. Humans began to internalize these lessons, linking observation of the external environment with reflective understanding of life's rhythms. This awareness shaped early philosophy, emotional resilience, and social norms, providing a framework for interpreting both natural and human phenomena. Spatial awareness and environmental mastery expanded during this period. Humans explored previously inaccessible areas, tested new tools, and refined techniques for hunting, foraging, and movement. Engagement with the landscape was both practical and reflective, reinforcing cognitive maps, memory, and problem-solving. Humans learned to anticipate changes, interpret subtle signals, and coordinate action across space and time. The integration of observation, memory, symbolic practice, and social learning strengthened both survival capacity and reflective awareness, allowing humans to perceive the broader patterns governing their world. The interplay of individual and communal experience was particularly evident. Personal observation, reflection, and skill development were embedded in shared practices, rituals, and narratives. Knowledge, attention, and emotional experience were transmitted collectively, reinforcing social cohesion and shaping consciousness. Humans recognized that survival and meaning were not solely individual endeavors, they depended on integration with community, cycles of the environment, and shared reflective practice. This awareness laid the groundwork for culture, social identity, and collective symbolic reasoning. Ultimately, this midwinter transition was both practical and profound. Humans learned to read the environment with increasing sophistication, anticipate change, and integrate observation with memory, emotion, and symbolic practice. Social, cognitive, and reflective capacities were simultaneously enhanced through collaborative action, ritual, and storytelling. The emerging landscape became a teacher, offering lessons in endurance, pattern recognition, continuity, and renewal. Humans were not merely surviving, they were beginning to understand, reflect upon, and shape their engagement with the world, creating the foundation for the symbolic, social, and spiritual capacities that would define human experience for generations to come. Through these weeks, the integration of cognition, emotion, observation, and symbolic thought solidified. Humans learned that survival was inseparable from reflection, that memory and storytelling encoded both practical and emotional knowledge, and that ritual and symbolic practice reinforced social cohesion and foresight. The landscape, with its subtle transformations, became a mirror of human capacity for resilience, pattern recognition, and imaginative engagement. This period of transition illuminated the interconnectedness of life, reinforcing awareness of cycles, mortality, and renewal, and shaping the foundation for cultural, spiritual, and cognitive development in ways that would resonate for millennia. The slow emergence of midwinter light marked a turning point in the way early humans experienced their environment, their communities, and their own consciousness. After months of darkness, the faint lengthening of days was not merely a physical phenomenon, it was a deeply emotional and psychological event. Humans, who had endured the longest nights with vigilance, patience, and attentiveness, began to perceive subtle changes in temperature, light quality, and the behavior of flora and fauna. The forest, previously frozen and silent, revealed minute signs of life, streams murmuring beneath thinning ice, tiny shoots pushing through snow-laden soil, and birds cautiously returning along migratory paths. Every detail was an opportunity to learn, anticipate, and act, blending survival with reflection, observation with imagination. Humans were not only witnessing change, they were beginning to interpret it, internalize it, and embed it into symbolic and communal frameworks of understanding. The observation of wildlife became a focal point of daily activity. Prey species emerged cautiously from winter hiding, moving in patterns that were now predictable to skilled trackers. Predators adjusted their hunting strategies, exploiting newly accessible terrain and vulnerable prey. Humans, attuned to these nuances, refined their own approaches, using memory, pattern recognition, and collaborative strategies to anticipate animal behavior. The winter landscape demanded patience and precision, reinforcing cognitive faculties that integrated observation, inference, and planning. Each successful hunt or foraging expedition was both a practical victory and an experiential lesson in the cycles of life and the subtle interdependence between species, time, and environment. Foraging during this transitional period provided both sustenance and insight. As frost receded, roots, tubers, and early shoots became accessible. Streams, partially thawed, revealed fish and small aquatic life. Humans learned to interpret these signs not only as sources of food but as indicators of environmental rhythm and timing. The act of gathering was deeply meditative, requiring attention to detail, anticipation of growth patterns, and careful judgment of risk. Humans increasingly associated environmental cues with symbolic significance, linking survival with observation, reflection, and emotional response. The world became a source of both nourishment and meaning, teaching lessons that extended beyond immediate necessity. Social structures were reinforced during this period of subtle environmental change. Longer daylight allowed humans to engage in more complex collective activities, coordinated hunts, extended foraging expeditions, and maintenance or expansion of shelters. Elders guided younger members, imparting not only practical techniques but symbolic and ritual knowledge. Knowledge transfer was multidimensional, encompassing memory, attention, observation, and cultural narrative. Group cohesion strengthened, as cooperative action was intertwined with shared reflection, storytelling, and symbolic engagement. Humans learned that survival was inseparable from community, that observation and reflection were social acts as much as individual ones, and that shared experience enhanced both practical and cognitive capacity. Ritualized behavior maintained a central role, extending beyond solstice observances into post-solstice activity. Firelight, arranged stones, pigments, and coordinated gestures encoded knowledge, memory, and symbolic meaning. These practices reinforced attentiveness, sharpened cognition, and strengthened social bonds. Participation in ritual allowed humans to navigate complex emotional states, fear, hope, anticipation, and relief, while aligning individual and collective action. Ritual acted as a bridge between observation, symbolic representation, and reflection, offering a medium through which humans could interpret and internalize the patterns of their world. Symbolic thought became increasingly sophisticated. Humans began to recognize and encode relationships between events, behaviors, and cycles. Environmental cues were interpreted not solely for immediate utility but also for broader significance. The emergence of early shoots, the thaw of streams, and the return of certain birds were linked to notions of renewal, endurance, and the continuity of life. Objects, gestures, and arrangements were deliberately created to communicate observation, memory, and emotional insight. Humans were developing a layered understanding of the environment, embedding perception into social, symbolic, and cognitive frameworks that extended beyond the immediate moment. The emotional dimension of post-solstice life was complex and profound. Humans experienced relief at the return of light, hope for forthcoming abundance, and lingering caution from the preceding months of scarcity and darkness. These emotions were processed individually and communally. Storytelling, ritual, and shared labor provided a mechanism for regulating emotion, reinforcing attention, and integrating experience. Humans learned that emotion could be structured, directed, and amplified through collective practice. The post-solstice period offered a unique opportunity for emotional, cognitive, and social integration, reinforcing resilience and reflective awareness. Observation of natural patterns during this period was both practical and philosophical. Humans tracked animal movement, the thawing of ice, and subtle changes in vegetation, interpreting these cues to guide action. These observations were contextualized within broader temporal and spatial frameworks, allowing humans to anticipate outcomes and plan for future contingencies. This pattern recognition, coupled with memory and social knowledge, reinforced both immediate survival and reflective understanding. Humans began to perceive cycles in the environment as analogous to cycles in human experience, linking observation with meaning, endurance with insight, and survival with reflection. The aesthetic qualities of the landscape reinforced symbolic and reflective thought. Frost glinting on branches, sunlight filtering through thinning canopies, and the delicate emergence of vegetation provided sensory richness that humans internalized. These experiences encouraged abstraction, imagination, and symbolic association. The interplay of observation, emotion, and aesthetic appreciation fostered cognitive flexibility and reflective capacity. Humans were beginning to perceive that beauty, pattern, and rhythm in the environment carried significance beyond mere survival, contributing to the emerging foundation of spiritual and symbolic understanding. Memory and narrative continued to play a central role in human culture. Elders recounted cycles of previous years, teaching not only survival techniques but also the significance of observation, patience, and symbolic engagement. Stories encoded environmental knowledge, social norms, and emotional experience, transmitting understanding across generations. Children absorbed both practical and symbolic lessons, learning to navigate the world with attention, reflection, and anticipation. Memory, storytelling, and symbolic practice converged, reinforcing cognitive, social, and emotional development, and embedding awareness of cycles, resilience, and renewal into communal consciousness. Symbolic and ritual practices facilitated imagination and foresight. Humans began to anticipate the gradual return of warmth, the behaviors of animals, and the timing of plant emergence. By engaging with symbols, gestures, and objects, humans could mentally rehearse actions, project outcomes, and integrate observation into predictive frameworks. Symbolic thought allowed humans to bridge immediate survival with long-term understanding, reinforcing both practical and reflective capacities. The post-solstice period became a laboratory for experimenting with cognition, imagination, and social coordination, enhancing the depth and flexibility of early human consciousness. Awareness of mortality and renewal remained central. The preceding months of scarcity and darkness highlighted vulnerability, reinforcing the importance of observation, collaboration, and endurance. The faint return of light and the early signs of life offered hope and illustrated the continuity of cycles. Humans internalized these lessons, linking survival with reflective understanding of life's rhythms. This awareness informed not only practical behavior but also emerging philosophical and spiritual reflection, providing a framework for interpreting both natural and human phenomena. Spatial awareness and environmental mastery were honed during this period. Humans explored new areas, tested tools, and experimented with movement and hunting strategies. These activities reinforced cognitive mapping, attention to detail, and predictive reasoning. Humans learned to anticipate environmental change, interpret subtle cues, and coordinate actions across space and time. The integration of observation, memory, ritual, and social learning strengthened both survival and reflective awareness, enabling humans to perceive broader patterns and relationships governing the environment. The interplay of individual and communal experience was critical. Personal observation, reflection, and skill development were embedded within collective practices, rituals, and storytelling. Knowledge, attention, and emotional experience were transmitted and reinforced communally, strengthening cohesion and shaping consciousness. Humans learned that survival, insight, and meaning were inseparable from social integration, collective memory, and cooperative engagement. The post-solstice period functioned as a crucible for developing the cognitive, social, and symbolic skills essential for long-term cultural and spiritual development. Ultimately, this phase of emerging light and environmental transition was both practical and transformative. Humans learned to read subtle environmental cues, anticipate change, and integrate observation, memory, and symbolic practice. Social structures were reinforced, cognitive capacity expanded, and emotional resilience strengthened. The post-solstice landscape offered a canvas for reflection, teaching endurance, pattern recognition, continuity, and renewal. Humans were learning to navigate the world not only as a space of survival but as a medium of observation, reflection, and meaning-making, laying the groundwork for symbolic, cultural, and spiritual capacities that would define human experience for millennia. Through these weeks, early humans cultivated an integrated understanding of the environment, community, and inner experience. Observation, symbolic practice, ritual, and social learning converged to reinforce memory, reflection, and foresight. Humans began to perceive cycles, anticipate outcomes, and align action with both immediate need and long-term understanding. The post-solstice period illuminated the interconnectedness of life, reinforcing awareness of mortality, renewal, and resilience. It was a formative time in which humans were learning not merely to survive but to perceive, interpret, and engage with the world in ways that shaped consciousness, culture, and the capacity for inner transformation.